All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this year's virtual Lower Fox Farmer Roundtable. So I'm Jamie Patton. I'm your outreach specialist for Northeast Wisconsin with the Nutrient and Pest Management Program and your host today. So before we get started, I do want to take a minute to thank this year's sponsors as well as organizers. So even in a virtual format, it takes a lot of work to get this put together so that it will run smoothly today. I also wanted to draw your attention. You would have seen the sponsors logos on the bottom of the opening screen. So if you have the opportunity, go ahead and give them a thank you next time that you see them. So whether in person or online, we wouldn't be successful without these individuals, and we wouldn't be successful without you for that matter. So thank you for joining us today. So I know many of you are familiar with virtual presentations, but WebEx may be a new platform for you. So on the right-hand side of your screen, it's backwards on mine. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see the control panel. So as you watch the slideshow, remember to keep yourself muted and your video off. If possible, you have controls at the top of the screen. So you'll have a little microphone to mute yourself, and you'll also have a little video camera to stop showing your video. You'll also have the opportunity, if you're having problems with hearing today, if you click on the audio portion of your control panel, you'll be able to find the call-in number, and that may be a better option if your internet is unstable today. Also, if you're an attendee, you're going to see, rather than chat, you'll see a question box at the bottom of your control panel. Please feel free to type in questions at any point in time. They will be feeding into the presenters, and you'll see, and if it looks really bright for me, that's because it looks like I'm controlling air traffic today. So I have multiple screens, so we'll see your questions pop up, and we'll be able to bring those on to the presenters to answer. And lastly, there will be CCA credits today. So as usual, there'll be a CCA QR code at the end of the presentation, and at that time, you can type in your name and CCA number if you are unable to scan that QR code. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to introduce our first speakers. So Jessica Schultz and Todd Brennan. So Jessica is the Executive Director of the Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance, and Todd is the Senior Policy Manager at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. They will be updating us on the Great Lakes, the Bay of Green Bay, as well as the Fox River, and talk to us about the local efforts to improve local water quality.
Well, thanks, Jamie. Good morning, everyone. We appreciate everyone attending in this format, and wish we could be in person. We've tried that, but at least this affords us some unique opportunities to hold some additional sessions and breakout sessions, which hopefully can extend the learning. But my name's Todd Brennan, and as Jamie said, I'm with a group called the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and we are a regional organization working to protect the water and sustain the life that depends on our Great Lakes. And this is, I think, our 6th year supporting and helping to coordinate the Fox Watershed Farmer Roundtable. So you may have seen me before, different machinations of my facial hair, but still the same guy inside. And we've been doing this we've been really pleased to be doing this, and we've been doing it for 2 reasons. One, to bring awareness to the water and what nutrients can do in the form of nutrient pollution that causes harmful algal blooms in the whole system on the Fox watershed. So that's from Lake Winnebago to the Fox River and the Bay of Green Bay, as well as other parts of the Great Lakes. You're not alone in that case. But also the second most important reason is the conservation that really holds the key to diminish and eventually stop these algae blooms from occurring. So we know that in doing more conservation, that your land will improve, and as your soil health improves, which makes your farm more resistant to that harmful runoff and nutrient pollution that can shed off the land, affecting the water. We also know it means your fields and towns are less prone to flooding, which contributes less to downstream flooding, which makes the downstream communities that receive that water more resilient. So that is what we hope and work and plan for, and why we're here with you today. Lastly, I want to introduce Jessica Schultz with the Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance, who is ours and your local partner in the Fox Wolf Watershed, helping to do that work. We've teamed up with Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance, who is now coordinating the Fox Watershed Farmer Roundtable, and is doing an awesome job. Thus far, so far, you know, fingers crossed, we haven't had a hiccup. So really hats off to them, and I want to thank them. But we've also partnered with the Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance on a basin-wide planning effort that really just leverages a lot of the good work that's already happening in the watershed and the momentum that has been building farm by farm, watershed by watershed in the Fox Wolf Basin. And we're now aiming towards a goal of achieving a 30% reduction by 2030 and a 60% reduction in phosphorus by 2040. So I know that sounds like maybe a big goal and a long way off, but I also, as I tell people, for example, the 30% reduction by 2030, that's just 10 growing seasons between now and then. So I know it's 10 years to try to figure out how do we cycle through to get the reductions that we want. But I also know people appreciate having a goal. And so we've put ourselves behind this goal, and we hope to join you in that effort. And we know it's not easy, but we need you. In fact, you're probably the most critical partner in the whole effort. So Jessica's going to explain a little bit more of what they do at Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance and also the effort. And I will just end by saying thanks for showing up today. Best of luck, and learn a lot, ask questions, and keep the effort moving forward towards the goal. So thank you. Jessica, take it away.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Emily, for letting me know that I was sharing my wrong screen. So can everyone see the correct screen now with the Alliance for the Great Lakes slide up? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Todd. I wasn't exactly sure where Todd was going to leave off this morning, so I figured no matter where that was, talking about the value of Northeast Wisconsin waters would be a great place to start. For those that don't know me, I am Jessica Schultz, the Executive Director of the Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance. I'm from Little Chute, born and raised, and now raising my family there. This area in Wisconsin is special to me. For a lot of reasons, but one, we've been blessed with a lot of abundant water resources. And whether we determine the value of our water by its recreational use, ability to generate power, public health, industrial or agricultural use, drinking water, tourism, or even my latest favorite is all the craft breweries that are popping up in this area. I don't think anyone would deny that water ties our community together and brings value to our region. The Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance works with partners in urban stormwater, agriculture, and wastewater to find cost-effective solutions to work towards water quality goals. In the past 6 years, we've been able to secure over $6 million in Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding that went to build staff capacity at county land conservation departments in Outagamie, Brown, Calumet, and Fond du Lac, as well as provide cost share for farmers. For those not familiar with the Fox Wolf Basin, it's a large land mass that covers 10% of Wisconsin's land, boasts 17% of Wisconsin's in-lake surface water, and drains to the Bay of Green Bay. This is the lower Fox River. It starts from Lake Winnebago and drains northeast into Green Bay. And that's where we're going to spend our time talking about today. The lower Fox River drains 630 square miles before entering into the Bay of Green Bay. While we've seen great improvements in the Fox River since the Clean Water Act, significant decreases in industrial and municipal wastewater pollution resulted in our communities once again being really proud of the waters and turning our faces towards the waters again. We've seen new river walks, trails, and additional public access points going in over the past decade. While we have a lot to celebrate in order to ensure our waters are a resource for future generations, we still have a lot of work to do. Excess phosphorus and sediment loading into our waterways is increasing frequency and severity of algae blooms, including harmful green algae blooms, as well as the sediment is decreasing the dissolved oxygen levels, resulting in dead zones in the Bay of Green Bay. A study called the Total Maximum Daily Load was conducted for the lower Fox River by Wisconsin DNR and approved by EPA in 2015. This study assigned the phosphorus loading in our waterways to a variety of sources, including wastewater treatment plants, agriculture, and urban runoff. But the TMDL did more than just identify the sources of pollution. The TMDL serves as essentially a pollution diet for our waterways. It tells us how much pollution a water body can handle while still meeting goals of that water body, and then assigns reduction targets to each of the sources of those pollution. For the Lower Fox River, in order to meet water quality targets, reduction goals were assigned to wastewater, urban stormwater, and agriculture. So how are these reductions achieved? Wastewater treatment facilities have Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits, WPDES permits, that require compliance. Since the time of TMDL approval in 2015, reduction targets have been worked into all treatment facilities in the Lower Fox River. Wastewater treatment facilities have 5 years to meet reduction targets to remain in compliance with their permits, unless they choose an alternate compliance option. While most wastewater treatment facilities are choosing to do bricks and mortar facility upgrades to meet their permit requirements, there are some that are exploring other options. One of those is New Water, the Green Bay Metropolitan Sewerage District. They launched a new program to improve area streams and habitat and preserve sustainable agriculture in order to achieve permit compliance through a new option called adaptive management. After they completed a pilot project in Duck Creek that proved successful in showing that New Water could work with landowners to improve water quality through practices such as increased ground cover and stormwater management, New Water selected Ashwaubenon Creek and Dutchman Creek watersheds for implementation of a long-term watershed program that will be included in their wastewater discharge permit. If we have any farmers joining us today from Ashwaubenon and Dutchman watersheds, watch for New Water working in your watershed. I think they're going to be a great partner to you over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. 25 communities in the Lower Fox River have MS4, or Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permits through the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that will require them to meet TMDL reductions from the stormwater that runs off their communities prior to reaching the Fox River. In 2018, MS4s in the area had to submit a plan to DNR to outline how they would work towards the TMDL goals. And now each year, the communities must submit an annual report that show how they're making progress towards those goals. It's anticipated that MS4s will have 3 to 4 permit cycles, or 15 to 20 years to meet compliance. Just like agriculture practices, there are structural and non-structural best management practices for urban stormwater solutions. Communities will have to use a combination of practices in order to meet water quality targets, especially in the older, more developed communities. Because the reductions required are significant, individual urban residents will be asked to contribute towards improving water quality as well by reducing the amount of runoff that leaves their property through things like permeable pavers or installation of rain gardens, and increasing the quality of water that leaves their property by managing their leaves and sweeping their grass clippings off of hard surfaces. I don't have to tell anyone on this call how important agriculture is to Northeast Wisconsin. Besides covering a large portion of our landscape, a healthy agricultural system is part of our community and our economy. While there are some state standards for agriculture that work towards conservation, the targets that are identified within the TMDL are for the most part beyond any requirements that exist. Meeting the agricultural conservation goals beyond the state standards will take producers like you all on the call today voluntarily implementing conservation practices. In order to meet water quality goals, a combination of cropping practices and or structural practices will have to be applied to the majority of the acres in the watershed. There are many organizations many of whom are represented on the call today, who are working to increase efficiency of these practices, to learn more about how to implement practices like cover crop and reduced tillage to increase soil health. There are many farmers, again, many of you who are on the call today, who are already testing innovative solutions and new equipment, who are opening up their fields to research and monitoring so that we can better understand the practices that have the largest impact on building soil health and improving water quality. There are many of you already who are opening up their farms to field days so that other producers have the opportunity to learn from those of you who are actually doing these practices, and opening up your fields to research for monitoring. So thank you for those of you that are leaders in this already for helping to chart the way. I want to wrap up by letting you know of an effort currently underway being led by the Fox-Wolf Watershed Alliance, the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and DNR, as well as many other partners, to figure out how we can move forward to meet these water quality goals over the next 20 years. We know it's an aggressive target for wastewater, for stormwater, and for all of our agricultural producers. But believe that if it can be done anywhere, it can be done in Northeast Wisconsin, if we can all work together. Thank you to all of you who have joined the call today for continuing to learn about these conservation practices. We appreciate you being a partner in conservation. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jessica. And just as a reminder to the attendees, if you have a question, go ahead and type them in the question box within your control panel. So we do have one question. So Todd and Jessica, if you'd like to turn your videos back on so you can address the question. The question is, I see a lot of stream bank erosion. Is stream bank erosion a concern for water quality?
Well, that is a really good question. Stream bank erosion is a concern for water quality. We do have a lot of sediment and phosphorus that leave our stream banks because of stream bank erosion. One thing that we need to consider, we can fix stream banks by doing stream bank restoration in both the urban communities and in agricultural communities. But we should also, we have to focus on the cause of the stream bank erosion and not just patch over the solution or patch it with stream bank restoration. So we know that we're seeing increased flashiness of streams because of an increased amount of runoff, could be due to more intense rain events. So we need to start building capacity on the landscape, whether that's through improved soil health for increased infiltration or storage on the landscape for water in order to really solve that stream bank problem.
Thank you, Jessica. Todd, do you have?
Oh, Jamie, just quick, I want to Todd, I'll let Todd jump in, but I made one mistake on when I was talking about New Water's project. So I'm going to backtrack a minute. When I was talking about New Water's adaptive management project, I said Duck Creek and I meant Silver Creek. So, so I'm just going to make that clarification real quick. All right, sorry, Todd, did you have something to add to the stream bank?
No, I'm good. Thanks for answering.
Very good. So we do have another question. It says, how do you know if a farm is meeting its conservation goals for water quality?
That's a tough one this morning, but a great question. So right now we are actually working with the counties, Outagamie County, Brown County, and Calumet County on developing a progress report that we're working to tie into SNAP Plus, which is a tool that I know many of you use already, or many of your agronomists use already to manage the nutrients on your farm. So we're working on a report that would pull the data from SNAP Plus and compare it to phosphorus runoff targets that have been developed as part of that TMDL process to be able to better communicate with people like all of you who are helping us work towards conservation targets, so you can actually know what the goal is that you're working towards. So watch for that. Hopefully sometime this year, a draft of that we'd love to get out. We'll also be looking for input on that. So if you're willing to talk with us about utilizing the progress report or developing the progress report, how it could be helpful to you, please let me know, reach out.
Todd, do you want? All
No,
right. Okay.
well stated.
I just want to make sure you have opportunity. So, all right. How about Todd? You want to address one? So, are other parts of the state or other areas around the Great Lakes experiencing the same water quality issues we are, or is it unique to Northeast Wisconsin?
So answer to the first part is yes. It is happening all around the state and all around the Great Lakes Basin. As many people may know just from seeing, a pond on their land that receives excess nutrients in the form of manure or fertilizer or even dirt, can harbor a lot of that phosphorus. And you'll see the scum that forms oftentimes, not to be differentiated with like duckweed, which is the little petals at the top, but harmful algae usually almost turns the water green. They're blue-green algae, and so that's happening in inland waterways all around the state. Usually, what it takes is a sort of a shallower body of water that has a lot of land shedding to it with a lot of nutrients, and so that's what also makes, when you think on a big scale, Great Lakes-wise, you got a lot of water moving in and out. That's why having these harmful algal blooms is usually kind of unique in the Great Lakes, because dilution usually solves that problem. But you see it in these compoundments like Green Bay, where you have a fairly shallow body of water surrounded, and then it's being shed by water a lot of land. And that's the case in Green Bay. It's also the case in Western Lake Erie, shallower body of water being fed by a lot of land. So for example, in Green Bay, 1/3 of Wisconsin sheds water to it ultimately, and it represents about 20% of the watershed area for the entire Lake Michigan. So it's a lot of land shedding to just really a small body of water. And so what's happening on the land is going to dictate the health of the water. So we see these hot spots, as they're called, in Green Bay, Western Lake Erie, Saginaw Bay off the mitt of Michigan, are 3 of these algae outbreak hotspots around the Great Lakes.
Thank you, Todd. Jessica, do you want to add to?
I think as far as the state and the Great Lakes region, Todd is much more of an expert than I. So I will add, though, that Lake Winnebago does experience a lot of harmful algal blooms, and they are increasing in intensity. And just so everyone knows, we're talking about the Lower Fox today, but a very similar effort is taking place around the Lake Winnebago system and the drainage area for the Upper Fox and Wolf Rivers. So a lot of great work being done by farmers and conservation professionals to work together to figure out how to improve runoff. Again, we got a long way to go, but we do have a lot to celebrate.
Thank you, Jessica and Todd. And probably one of our last questions for today for you until the end of the webinar. Are there any new projects coming up in 2021 that you're really excited about?
Todd, do you want to take that first, or you want me to go?
Why don't you go?
Oh, thank you for that. There are a lot that I'm excited about. We are part of the planning effort that I mentioned at the end. We are starting to build a brand for the Lower Fox River recovery effort that we can engage a variety of stakeholders with, to let them know about what's happening in the region and to build support, whether that is increasing financial support, so we have cost share dollars to continue with implementation, or increasing volunteer support to do projects out on the landscape. So I'm excited that we're going to be getting more people involved with the recovery effort. On that note, we'd love to tell people stories. So if you are doing something on your farm, or if your organization is doing something that is worth highlighting, we do send out newsletters to the public. Please let us know, and we'll share your success, because that definitely motivates others.
Well, and I want to plug something for Jessica. There's a watershed celebration, which happens in conjunction with the Fox Wolf Watershed Alliance Conference, which is a great conference that really sets the tone for a lot of this stuff. And moving forward, the plan is to both celebrate the water, but also measure progress along the way. And so tune in to that. And I don't know, Jessica, if you can key in on what night that is and if there's a way that people can find out more info.
Yep, definitely. That is going to be Wednesday, March 3rd at 6 o'clock. So we could send out an invite to that with the wrap up from this meeting. So if anyone is interested, it's going to be an 1.5-hour celebration that talks about what to expect over the next year with the planning effort and reporting out, like Todd mentioned, as well as highlighting some watershed heroes. So we'd hope that you join us.
Yeah, and on that note, to answer what I'm most excited about is, so part of this planning effort is we form different work groups and teams, and we have some farmers involved in some of these teams that are helping us coordinate and think through the way that we educate about this outreach, as well as even the way that we try to think about how we approach the problem and measure. And one of the things we're trying to do we call shared measurement, which is really just to figure out a way that we as a group can share in the learning, the data, the interpretation, and then the presentation of that information to gauge how well we're doing. So how's the progress? Where is it trending? And over time, what are we seeing? So that we know whether we're starting to really move the needle and what we're doing on the land is actually resulting in the water. Like Jessica said, and I think I touched on, there's been a lot of good work. So now the goal is to try to exonerate that good work by helping to measure the response in the water and know where things are working versus where things might not be working and how we should adapt along the way. So it's going to be a diligent, constant process that's going to require the right funding and the right cohesion around that effort. But I'm most excited to see how we do that over this year, because it's really the first time we'll have sort of tackled this as a big group, but it really will hopefully show benefits.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Todd and Jessica. And so I'm sure you'll be around at the end of the webinar if there's additional questions that come in through the question box. But thank you again, and round of applause. Silent, you can't hear it, but round of applause. And thank you. So I will ask our panelists to join me now in the screen. So we're going to be hearing from some local dairy farmers and nutritionists. So hopefully, if you're like me, so you can tell that it's been a year into the COVID. So I come prepared with not only my coffee, but also my thermos for things like this, because this is something you're not going to want to miss. So joining me now are John Lamers with Seven Oaks Dairy, Paul Natsky with Wayside Dairy, Dan Olson with Forage Innovations, and Paul Dyke with GPS Dairy Consulting. They're going to be discussing alternative forages on the farm and how to use them in the dairy ration. And the panel is going to be moderated by Nick Peltier from Brown County Land and Water Conservation Department. All right, take it away, John.
All right, thank you very much. So I just want to start out by thanking everybody for taking the time to the other panel members and stuff to be here as well. Obviously, it takes a little bit of time commitment, but it's also fun to share the different things that we're doing from different aspects. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a fourth generation family dairy right along the east side of the Fox River. On the west side of the, or on the north side of the picture, you can just see the Fox River there. So I was on this panel a few years ago. At that time, we were just getting very early into cover crops and alternate, I guess at that time, we little bit of exploration into alternative forages. So milk about 1,150 cows and crop about 2,000 acres. We've have a true passion around preserving water quality and doing our part to make an impact, a positive impact, and contributing to the learning that ultimately is really going to pave the way to sustainable agriculture, I think, in Wisconsin, and allow us to continue to do what we love on a daily basis. And like I said, it's really exciting to be a part of the learning and also get to work with all the great professionals in the industry and across industries that that we're all in this together, learning together, and there's a lot of pride in that. Like I said, so we've been doing cover crops and minimal use of alternative forages over the last 8 years. I guess more extensive on the cover crop side, but not as much on the using it as forage. So this year, and we actually have another meeting following this one, but getting together with our team at the dairy, as well as our nutritionists, stuff like that, talking about how do we go forward, navigating cover crops, alternative forages, how do they fit in, how are they going to work with water quality, and trying to come up with the metrics that we need to track and follow to understand the profitability of this, the sustainability of what we're doing. Like they touched on earlier, quantifying the result, or quantifying what we're doing, and so that we can actually have good information to make decisions off of going forward. That's kind of where our focus is right now. There's a lot to be learned as far as I'm talking about me personally in our dairy, a lot to be learned as far as the profitability of different systems that we're trying, and there's just a lot to be learned that way. So like I said, I'm humbled to be here with all these people on this panel, and like I said, the most exciting part of this whole thing for me is like the group learning, and I think we're all in this together for the same reasons, and it's very exciting.
Okay, thanks a lot, John. That was great. Next, we'll hear from our next panelist, Paul Natsky, Wayside Dairy in the big metropolis of Wayside. Go ahead, Paul.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. We are a family-owned farm that today I'm pinch hitting for my Uncle Dan, and I'm also privileged to work with my cousins Jenna and Jeremy. We kind of hang our hat on our dedicated staff, and we're blessed to have them, and we've even have some employees that have been with us for over 25 years, so we appreciate that. We're also lucky to work with some amazing consultants and people that help us with these projects. It was because of the NRCS that we actually started cover crops about 6 years ago. We mainly plant triticale and rye to get some green cover over the winter. Our triticale is used as an alternative forage for heifers and dry cows. And if we're low on alfalfa some years, we'll take it as a high quality, cut it before first crop, and get some cow feed that way. We milk approximately 2,000 cows and run around 3,150 acres. We are actually looking forward to this summer building a tester and RNG skid to look for sustainability over the future for our dairy, and working with a reputable neighbor in the Collins family to do that. We are part of the branch watershed in our area, and part of our cover crop usage is to keep those waters clean, as we learned about in the beginning. I think that's it for now, and I'll be ready for questions later. Thank you.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks a lot, Paul. Next panelist, Dan Olson, farmer, consultant, and social media extraordinaire. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for having me, guys. So I'm a 7th generation dairy farmer. We have we're actually milking on a couple dairies here in northeastern Wisconsin by Lena, so we're actually not in the watershed. We're north of Green Bay. We've been working with alternative forages for quite a few years on our dairies, and then when we say alternative forages, I guess for sake of what my definition of that would be anything that isn't alfalfa or corn silage. But, at other areas of the country that might look something different. And then through my company, Forge Innovations, right now I'm working with about 800,000 cows around the country doing consulting work and building forage systems. So one of the main reasons why we like alternative forages is because of the nutrient management um, and rotational benefits of it. And so that's what we've been focusing on, is trying to manage these crop rotations, tightening them up extremely tight, and using annuals instead of perennials largely in these systems. Now, like on our farm, we have roughly 30% of the farm, 20 to 30%, planted in long-term perennial grass legume stands. And we're doing those in highly erodible, poorly drained soils. And then the remaining 70 or 80% is in an aggressive rotation of corn silage, followed by a winter small grain, either cereal rye or triticale, followed by an annual. And that could be anything like this cocktail mix picture with the BMR sorghum sudan, Italian ryegrass, clovers, or we use a lot of other things, photoperiod sensitive sorghum sudan for dry cow heifer diets, but using a lot of these other alternative forages and putting them in between corn silage crops. And by doing that, we're able to maximize the yields on those acres, because we have something growing there 12 months out of the year. We don't have that seeding year yield drag that we get with the annuals or with the perennials. And we're able to turn all our corn on the farm into first year corn. And that, I think, long term, that's going to be a really important piece of this in northeastern Wisconsin, is thinking of how we can maximize the yield per acre to try to pull as much phosphorus off as we can and still maintain our rations on our farms. One of the big challenges, and if we're going to reduce this phosphorus load, like they were talking about in the earlier presentation, is we're going to have to think about ways that not to pull that onto our farms. And right now we're using a lot of byproducts in diets. That dairies are using a lot of byproducts, and they do a really good job with it, whether it's gluten or cottonseed or soy hulls or whatever. But we're bringing a lot of this onto the farm, but a lot of those tend to be fairly high in phosphorus. And so if we can replace some of those fiber sources with forages, and these alternative forages do a very good job of that, we're able to reduce the overall phosphorus load that's migrating onto our farms, and hopefully keep it there versus letting it get into the waterways. So this slide that you're looking at here is just a scenario where on a normal 8-year rotation, we might have 4 years of corn followed by 4 years of alfalfa. Is there one more slide? There might be one that I'm missing here, but that's all right. I think, yeah, there we go. So this would be like a normal corn alfalfa rotation, where we have 4 years of corn with some descending yields, and maybe it's not that aggressive, but as a whole, on average, we're looking at about a 15% yield drag between first year and second year corn. And then we get into that first year alfalfa, and you get a couple good years, hopefully, if it doesn't winter kill, and then it starts tailing off again, and then you go right back into first year corn. But the most productive, cost-effective crop that we grow is first year corn. In northeastern Wisconsin, corn silage has become a huge, part of what we do for dairy rations, and I know Paul will talk about this some more. But there's some real challenges with trying to make that work in an environmentally friendly way, and getting manure out in timely fashion and stuff. But what we've done on our farm and on a lot of the dairies I work with is we've eliminated the perennial. And if we want to go back to that slide, that prior slide now. So by eliminating the alfalfa, if you want to just drop back one slide, if you can do that. By eliminating the alfalfa though, so that red line that goes across there is that same line that we just saw on average yield. But by eliminating the alfalfa and instead dropping an annual combination in between, we turn all our corn into first year corn. And so the yellow bars are, instead of having 4 years of corn and 4 years of perennial, we're still having 4 years of corn, but it's every other year instead of every year. And then in the middle, we're taking that triticale cutting and then we're following it with an annual. And that can be a lot of different things. But generally speaking, we can get those yields between those two crops up to close to where that second year corn yield would be. And then third year, you're right back into first year corn. And you can see in year 5, instead of that first year alfalfa yields, we're actually growing first year corn. So over an 8-year rotation, we're bringing off about 30% more yield per acre. And we're actually doubling the amount of phosphorus that we're removing. And also doubling the amount of digestible fiber that we're growing per acre. And that's where Paul will be talking about here some more. But much of the byproducts that we bring into lactating diets are digestible fiber sources. And so if we can grow more of that on our farms, we're able to potentially eliminate some of that. And instead of bringing phosphorus onto our farms in the form of byproducts, we're able to actually grow these products on our farms. I will pass it off to Paul.
Great, thanks a lot, Dan. Yeah, Paul, yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself. And we're fortunate enough to have a nutritionist on the panel today to kind of talk about how these alternative forages fit in dairy ration. So Paul, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think if we take a look almost at a snapshot of 10 to 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, we would look at Northeast Wisconsin and we were feeding corn silage and alfalfa. That's what we knew. You just do those two things very well. But we've kind of opened up our eyes and there's more things that folks are planting. So I think there's a couple things to keep in mind as we look at these alternative forages. Like Dan said, anything not corn silage or not alfalfa. If we're looking at the grasses that we might be growing, mixes of grasses, we need to think about where we're going to allocate those grasses. If we harvest them right, they'll actually have pretty high fiber levels. And at first we think high fiber levels, can we feed that to milk cows? But actually we can, because they're very digestible. They're maybe 50% NDF or 53, 55, but they're much more digestible than alfalfa. So we can actually include some of that those grasses right in the lactating diets and can work very well. In northeast part of the state US and New York, much more grasses are fed and grown than we see here in Wisconsin in terms of alfalfa. So it can be done and they can be used in high producing lactating diets. If we're going to look at all the alternative forages, I think there's a couple things we want to keep in mind as we're planting them. First thing is, who are we going to feed them to? If we're going to feed them out to heifers or dry cows, it's okay if we get a little bit more maturity to them. If we're going to feed them to high producing lactating cows, we need to have a discussion with the agronomist, with the nutritionist, say, when are we supposed to actually harvest that? If we're going to feed it to high producing lactating cows, we're going to harvest it earlier. I know it seems kind of obvious, but we want to make sure that we're allocating those forage correctly. We have a place in the bunker to go with them, and we have enough space in the bunker or that we can separate forages. I think that's kind of the other challenge when we have alternative forages and we have multiple crops. We might have corn silage, alfalfa, and then some sort of grass or alternative crop. Where are we going to store it? Are we going to put it in a bag? Do we have a third bunker? Are we going to layer it? How are we going to do that? And I think part of that discussion as well is when we harvest that alternative forage, how are we going to, do we have the right equipment to do it? And what moistures do we need to put them up at? Most of the grasses are probably going to be put up at 5 to 8% higher moisture levels than maybe alfalfa might. That's important to know so that we can make sure that it gets packed correctly, that it ferments correctly. If we're going to start doing layers, one alfalfa, one grass, one alfalfa, because we have different fields, that certainly could be a challenge if the moistures aren't right. And how do we proceed from field to field to make sure that we're going to have a bunker that's uniform and we don't have any layers in there that are problem layers, too wet, too dry, any mold layers, anything in there. We really want to make sure we harvest each one of those crops appropriately. So certainly there's lots of opportunity here. I think that we can look at those alternative forages and don't see them as, hey, we have to feed them, but more of an opportunity of, hey, this is high quality feed that can be really useful. I really like some of the alternative forages that might be like rilage or something that you might feed to dry cows. It provides an alternative forage that's going to give us a high fiber level. It may not be digestible, but that's exactly what I'm looking for my far off dry cows. For those folks that have heifers, we're always looking for that forage for the bred heifers, that forage that's, I'm not saying poor quality, but low energy, high fiber type product that works really well in those bred heifer rations. So by bringing in some alternative forage, additional forages, it gives us more options on the feeding side, as long as we can store it and feed it correctly. I want to build on Dan's one point about phosphorus in diets. Certainly that's a discussion to have with your nutritionist. It's amazing where we've come in the last 25 years. We used to feed diets that were 0.5% phosphorus because we thought it helped regrow. And we know we can go much lower than that. We can go well down to about 0.3 or so, or we can argue about where that number, but we've really reduced that phosphorus in the diet probably by about 35, 40% in the last 20 years. Most diets, most nutritionists are hitting those numbers. And like Dan said, maybe there's some byproducts that are still opportunities to lower that phosphorus a little bit more. So that's kind of my quick view of the world of how to feed alternative forages. Plan ahead.
Okay, sounds great. That's a great introduction. Thanks a lot, Paul. So the way this hopefully is going to run is we are looking for questions from the audience and viewers for this panel. So questions that you have, this is meant to be informational for folks that are watching and have questions and maybe want to know how these folks have made alternative forages and work on their farm. Like I said, type them in the question, the chat box, and we'll try to ask it to the panel here. First question I guess I have for maybe some of the farmers on the panel. You know, this is kind of a water quality is kind of the topic of this one, and the big topic with water quality is manure management. Maybe I'll maybe start with John and Paul Natsky. Could you guys maybe talk about alternative forages and the impact they've had on your manure management? Have they opened up additional windows for manure applications, or maybe made things a little tighter on your farm in terms of manure? Any issues you've noticed with manure, or maybe advantages? So I guess just kind of talk about that, guys. Take it away.
So I'll go first. So in the past for alternative forages, since at our dairy we only have cows there, heifers are all raised off site, so we really need to focus on putting up high quality forages, whether you want to consider them alternative forages or normal forages. The focus has to be on quality, because we don't have, other than moving it off farm or reselling that, we don't have much option to use those. So Trit has been our, as far as winter forages, has been what we've gone with. We've had been pretty successful getting that harvested, high quality, and been able to have a pretty good inclusion rate in our lactating mix. Thing we really like about that is usually it's coming off around the 15th or 20th of May, and we're able to follow that up, no-till planting corn right into that long as we're in there right after we harvest, the ground seems to be pretty mellow, pretty easy to plant into. And then we've followed that up with a top dress of manure application, usually around that 7,000 to 8,000 gallons per acre. Last summer, we did grow some photoperiod sensitive sorghum Sudan, as well as back to the after we followed up a crop of oats and peas, applied manure, and then followed that up with photoperiod sensitive sorghum Sudan, and that gave us some different windows to get nutrients applied that we never had in the past. We intended to take 2 cuts of the sorghum, but with as dry as it got to be last middle of July and August, it didn't really amount to anything coming back. So we ended up taking that opportunity to plant some of those fields into fall seeded perennial grasses. And so we did some drain tile work on a bunch of those fields to get, just like I said, took that opportunity to do something else. But it was a very, very nice window, especially last summer, obviously with it was pretty nice growing conditions all year, and you were able to get nutrients out when it came time to harvest corn silage the end of August, early September. We had very little manure in the pits yet that had to go out, and I think a lot of our manure applications also, we grow a lot of perennial grasses anyway, so we try to apply usually a couple different applications of 7,000 to 8,000 gallons of manure per acre on those acres as well. So it was really nice a nice change last fall from the years prior, having all those nutrients out and able to be taken up by the growing crops versus the couple of years prior to that were a major challenge.
To say the least, John. Thanks. Paul, I know you guys got a fair amount of manure there. Anything that you've noticed in terms of manure management?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that John was saying is exactly what's happening here. So we've the only difference is we've got 300 bred heifers here. So we take all our trit, mainly we take it after first crop, so that we have a bunker full for heifers and dry cows. But it does offer another window of opportunity for manure if you want to get it out after the triticale harvest. And then again in fall, you could also get some manure on the corn ground before you plant the triticale if the window presents itself that way. Otherwise, whatever John hit on was pretty much what I was going to say.
I'll also reemphasize
John. Great.
Paul's point of the importance of planning and planning for storage, planning of how it's going to be fed. That now more than in the past, that's probably more accepted than what it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Making sure that all the members of your team understand the challenges of alternative forages as well as the challenges of harvesting and packing it. I think that, it's not impossible by any means, but understanding the things from which inoculants are going to be used to just the chop length and the extra packing capacity that's going to be needed when you're dealing with things such as like perennial grasses. And like I said, I'll be the first one to sit here and tell you that it can come with some very frustrating challenges. Like I said, it's not that it can't be figured out, and just planning is very important, because like I said, there's nothing more frustrating than trying to figure out what you're going to feed these crops to after they're on the pile, and the size of the pile where if we thought it was going to be the quality that can be fed to the entire herd, well, now it can only be fed to the few dry cows and spring heifers. That's brings a whole other challenge of how you're going to manage the size of the pile and what it should be shaped like. So there's a lot of different working parts that need to be thought about. And like I said, not impossible by any means. With each challenge, I think there's about 5 opportunities. So like I said, just stuff. Definitely agree with Paul that those things need to be addressed.
I'm glad you brought that up, John, because I actually made a note of that during Paul's introduction that I wanted to kind of circle back to him on that. Paul, do you have any tips or considerations on storage for alternative feeds? You know, more
Well,
people seem to be
it's
going
going
to
to go
bunkers and
two
stuff.
different ways. I mean,
Go ahead.
so if you have, if you have a lot of trit that you're going to put up a lot, you have multiple fields, and you can put up and you have a separate bunker that's the right size for that, great. But I'm not sure everybody's going to have that. It depends, how they sequence it. If you're going to have layers, not my favorite in bunkers, but I'm not a big fan of bags either. Some folks would say, well, why not just put it in bags, as an alternative storage source? I'm not a fan of bags. I'd rather have, maybe, hesitate to say this, but a couple layers, just so that, because I can shave that down, I can remix it and then feed it to lactating cows, and they'll be okay if I sample it right, I measure it right, and I can't kind of sample it as we go in the bunker. I'd almost rather do that than try to tell somebody, hey, just put it in bags. Bags are very difficult to manage in my mind, and I'm sure there's some people listening that have bags, and they're certainly cost effective, and I understand why people do it. But they're a challenge. So it's just a matter of, I think, having a discussion ahead of time. You don't want to get to like a week before harvest and say, hey, where are we going to put that? Or, if you have just one field that you're trying to fit in with your other 10 fields, you're probably just going to layer it in at that point.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Perfect. Just taking a look at the questions here. Just a reminder again, if the audience has questions or something sparks your interest and you want to talk more about it, feel free to throw it in the chat box and we'll make sure to throw it in front of the panelists and get their take on it. Let's see here. Have you guys noticed any changes in the soil you would attribute to cover crops just to having a more diverse rotation? I know Dan, you touched on, getting more species out there just other than just corn and alfalfa. Just other changes in terms of water infiltration, trafficability, biological life, or even, some of the rotational advantages that you talked about, Dan. So I guess I'll open up to anyone. Feel free to talk about any changes you've noticed.
I can start with that one. We've noticed a little bit of wetter year that the ground will travel a little better if the triticale crop has been in there in the last year, and just being able to run different equipment out there, and so that's what we've seen on triticale on our acres anyway.
Paul, are you guys primarily doing no-till, or are you working in still doing some tillage in part of that rotation, or is it like no-till trit and then no-till corn after that, or what do you, how you guys doing?
Yeah, we try to do some of each. We try to get as much no-till as we can, but we have so much manure that sometimes that's not an option. But yeah, we are trying to do that, and that's part of our digester project. Hopefully, if that takes us our manure into a different form, we could be spreading that on different fields and maybe doing some more no-till in the future.
Great, thanks. I got a question for Dan Olson. Is he still with us, or is he having internet connectivity problems? Dan, can you chime in?
Shows he's offline from what I can see.
Okay. That's too bad, because we just got a question from the audience for Dan, so maybe we'll circle back to that. I guess a question for all three of you guys. I'm really interested to hear Paul's nutritionist standpoint on this question. When choosing cover crops and alternative forages, what are the most important decision factors that you guys look for or consider? Is it like plant timing or feed of tonnage or quality, or I guess talk about kind of how that works in with your operations? Maybe John, could you start with that one?
Are you taking that, Paul? What was it?
I thought he was asking you. So our main thing for triticale is the planting window. We're trying to get everything into the ground by October 1st. We don't plant any triticale later than the 10th of October. But most of our stuff revolves around that planting date and how soon we can get it in there.
Perfect. John, anything to add?
My audio was out for a little bit there. What was the question?
Let me see here, I totally misplaced it here. Oh, when choosing alternative forages, what are your most important decision-making factors? Is it like where it fits in your rotation, what you're looking for feed-wise, just maximum tonnage? I guess what are you looking for?
Like I said, in the past, it's been high digestibility, high quality is key, and so in the past, I don't feel we've had a good way to quantify that, overlapping the tonnage with the digestibility and really looking at, I think like in the dairy side, we've got a good handle on that, whether it's pounds of solids per hour out the door, but this is one of those things that the metrics for it, I don't think are maybe set in stone yet. Yeah, I think at least in our dairy, I feel like we're trying to kind of put all the pieces together to really, be able to compare apples to apples the way we can on a lot of other parts of the dairy or compare the metrics. But yeah, in the past, it's been, just high quality and high digestibility. But now, I said you have to bring in the tonnage of that as well. And there's a lot of working parts to it that we're in the process of putting together. And I think, probably
I was just going to ask you, do you notice a tonnage increase when you guys do trit and corn silage, or are you kind of breaking even, or are you coming out ahead tonnage wise?
So I can't really answer that with any certainty. We just added a scale in last year. I think in the past, not quite maybe understanding the nitrogen needs of not only the trit, but also the corn following trit was maybe caused us to have some yield drag. We were more reactive than proactive, and I'm excited. Now this will be the first year in the last couple that we actually have a good amount of winter forages that we intend to harvest, just because we didn't really have those windows the last couple of years. So excited to have the tools in place with the scale and stuff to be able to measure that data and figure out how we want to, obviously to track it field by field, we almost have to have samples taken from those specific fields at harvest. I understand they don't necessarily translate 100% to how that is coming out of the pile. We'll be able to, but that's what we'll have to use is the fresh feed samples going in and overlay that with the tonnage to be able to understand the true digestible amount of nutrients per acre that are coming off these fields.
Perfect, thanks, John. Got a question?
So Nick. Nick.
Sure, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. So the yield as triticale matures, I mean, there's an exponential curve. So if you take, and I know Tom Kilser will talk about this coming up, but when you take triticale at a flag leaf or pre-heading versus taking it post-heading by a few weeks, you can double yields. But of course, the quality comes down pretty dramatically. And so really and it still could even work in a lactating diet, but at a very low inclusion rate. So the more mature it goes, the less you're going to be able to feed. And so as you make decisions on when you want to harvest that, a lot of it has to do with how much you're going to want to feed to it's going to be lactating cows. Now, if it's, heifers, dry cows, then it's pretty easy. And like Natskis are doing, they're taking it later. That makes a lot of sense. But if it's only lactating cows, you got to think about what your inclusion rates are going to look like. If it's just a straw substitute in a lactating diet, well, that's a different discussion. But if you want to feed 4 or 6 or 8 pounds of dry matter, then you're going to have to be a lot more critical about when you harvest it.
Good, thanks, Dan. I'm glad you noted that. A question from the audience specifically addressed to you, Dan. Could you talk a little bit about or explain the trit cocktail mix that you showed in your diagram there earlier? Maybe what that includes, how that's managed?
Yeah, so those are 2 separate crops. What we're assuming in that diagram is a fall planted triticale, like the other dairy farmers are planting here, harvested in May, 1st of June, whatever that is, followed by a cocktail mix. And the most common one that's been done has been a combination of EMR sorghum sudan, Italian ryegrass, and legumes. And then that would be harvested like 3 times. And then the ryegrass, clover, the legumes would act as a cover crop the following winter. And then the next spring, you would no-till corn into that. But there's lots of different options. Like you said, that, if you're strictly feeding lactating cows, maybe we go to, I've been working with or just eliminating the sorghum sudan, and instead no-tilling Italian ryegrass and clover into that triticale in April, taking the triticale off in May for forage, and having that Italian ryegrass and legumes the rest of the year. That's going to have a lot lower fiber pool than the sorghum sudan, so we'll better large inclusion rates in rations, or even going the other way and going to more single cut type material for heifers and dry cows. So a lot of different directions you can go. But yeah, that cocktail specifically is one with the EMR sorghum sudan, Italian ryegrass, and clover.
Dan, are you getting any manure in that rotation at all, or after the trit, before the cocktail, or in between crops of cocktail?
So kind of the typical is to put it on between the triticale and the cocktail, and then again after the second cutting of sorghum of cocktail harvest. And if you want, you can do another one later in the fall after the 3rd cutting as well. We've kind of got away from applying manure after that first cutting of cocktail because it can really be difficult on the sorghum sudan and just the wheel traffic and stuff. So we're waiting till after the second crop of cocktail to put most of the manure out. But yeah, have farms with dribble bars, minimal disturbance, some surface applied, but yeah, we're getting out a lot of manure, and the farms that have fully implemented that, the fun part is we have basically all the manure out before we chop corn in the fall. That, I think, long term needs to be a goal for dairy farmers, is to try to get as much material out in the growing season, both to benefit from the nitrogen in that during the growing season, but also to get it and stabilize it instead of putting it on the shoulders of the growing season where nutrient loss is a lot more prevalent.
Good, thanks, Dan. I guess question for the farmers, and if the answer is no across the farmers, I'm going to kick it to Paul, because Paul Dykes, I think he'll have the best answer for this one. But anybody doing alternative forages in upright silos? And if so, what kind of management considerations are you using?
Yeah, that'd be a no for us.
Yeah, I figured.
Everything is in drive over piles.
Same here.
Okay. Dan Olson, do we lose you?
No, I just dropped my webcam. Somebody said they're having some issues with my bandwidth, so we'll see if this helps.
Oh, okay. Are you using upright silos to store any of your alternative forages? If so, what considerations would you have?
So we are not. I mean, I have farms that do. So the biggest thing is not putting it in the silo; it's getting out of the silo. So things like triticale, sorghum sudan, come out very well. So that's not an issue. You know, they're very similar to like corn silage. Italian ryegrass can be a real challenge to get out with, especially with top unloaders. It's gummy. It sticks in the blowers and it can be a real challenge. There's extremely high sugar levels, but can be a challenge getting out of uprights. But as Paul said earlier, basically all of these alternative forages, whether it's cool season grasses, triticales, sorghum sedans, all of them are going to be put up at a little higher moisture than alfalfa. So very similar to corn silage type moistures. If you want adequate packing to happen, otherwise they're going to tend to be kind of fluffy, and getting them stored properly can be a challenge.
Thanks, Dan. Paul, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, my only concern was moisture going into a tower silo. You know, whether it's seepage, I'm not sure that seepage is going to be an issue. It might be, but also just because it should go up wetter. If it goes up too dry, that can be a challenge too. I mean, it's not like alfalfa where you go, oh, it's a little drier, it'd be okay. It probably needs to be put up wetter to ferment correctly. So then you're like, how am I going to get that out of the tower silo? So I would think about it. If you're going to try it, you know, if you're going to commit to it, if the problem is if you can't get it out, then what? So I'd hesitate. I would hesitate.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, that could be a mess. You get a tower silo full of something you can't get out. That'd be bad news. So, question here from the audience for John Lamers. Why did Seven Oaks choose to seed some fields to perennial grasses?
So we actually ended up with perennial grasses by out of self-defense. If you're trying to grow alfalfa here, the last probably 10 years has been a real challenge, especially with the heavy clay soils and heavy rainfalls. So it kind of started out with interseeding tall fescue in with our alfalfa back in years past, and then just a couple large rainfall events when the alfalfa was small and let us, you know, pretty much took out the alfalfa, and went in to try to shore those fields up 2 or 3 different times with alfalfa. Each time that year that we seeded the alfalfa would come up and got taken out by another rain. And then that fall, we just went in and interseeded with grass and had a very successful catch on the grass. And the next growing season following that was also challenging with a lot of moisture. It was close by the dairy, so we had applied manure after that, and we saw the benefits of you know, when you apply manure on perennial grasses, it doesn't take near the hit, or really any of a hit like alfalfa does. The grasses really appreciate the nitrogen and seem to really do well. So we, like I said, I wish we had a scale to go back and compare at that time when we were still growing alfalfa to be able to see the yield difference over a year. So like I said, it was kind of by default that we ended up making the transition to perennial grasses. And the last few years, it's been very challenging with winter kill, and so we've been very fortunate to be able to minimize our purchase forages by having a significant amount of perennial grasses and managing them very intensely as far as what we put out there for nutrients. I mean, whether it's manure or commercial fertilizer, maximize yields and quality. So like I said, we got there by self-defense, and we've been very fortunate to have a team that kind of embraced what we saw, and everybody kind of got to experience it together as far as the benefits of it, and so we've made the commitment to stay with that program at this point, and so we started planting some clovers and with our perennial grasses though now too, so get a little bit more diversity, and we'll see where that goes. But so yeah, that's
Perfect. Thank you. A question for everybody, I guess. What windows have you seen to be the best for establishing triticale in the fall? After wheat or alfalfa, or after corn silage? What's kind of the most convenient? What gives you the best yields?
I'll take that one first. We've had good luck putting it after wheat, although you don't want to get it, we don't try to plant it in August at all. We try to get it in September. And also then we try to do some no-tilling into corn stubble, corn silage stubble, if we have right after the corn comes off, if that field doesn't get manure.
John or Dan, anything to add?
yeah. So in the past, we've always followed up corn silage with trit, and I think a lot of the yield drag that we've seen, or I guess sometimes we've been disappointed by the yields, was looking back now is maybe just planted too late in the fall. This year, all of our acres were planted in late August, early September, thanks to an early corn silage harvest due to the weather. But also we've made changes on our corn silage varieties and maturities to allow us to harvest earlier, knowing that we fully intend to get these winter forages planted early, and hoping to capture any yield loss that we may have had from the shortening up our corn silage maturity, capture that in the winter forage, and be able to manage our manure applications, and get those winter forages growing and established to be able to take up those nutrients and actually be something in the fall, versus just planted in middle to end of October where they hardly even get sprouted, and they're not. And I don't know, in the fall it doesn't seem like you really see much. But that first picture that was up during the slide when I was during the introduction, that's actually a fall planted trit field this year. I mean, it looks like it's just like a carpet. It's amazing when you walk out there. So we're really excited to see what the yields are going to be next spring. I mean, I know we've never had any winter forages go into winter looking like they did this year, as healthy and as established as they are.
Cool. What real quick follow-up question, John? What corn maturities were you using, and what maturities have you kind of moved to move that harvest window forward a little bit?
We're all the way up to 111, 113 day BMR, and now we're running the kind of in that 94 to 97, 94 to 101 day, and kind of worked it backwards, determining exactly when we wanted to be harvesting in the fall, with some barring any major weather catastrophes during the summer or whatever. But we know that we want to be harvesting those first couple weeks of September, and with the goals to have everything off by the middle of September, just because it feels like every year the corn silage gets harvested in the end of August, early part of September. I mean, you got good daylight. Even if you do get slowed down by a weather event, you still have some heat units, some drying that goes on. But man, I'll tell you, it gets really frustrating when in late September, even middle of October, and the days go by and nothing changes. The days go by and nothing changes, and just, so yeah, we, because like I said, kind of worked it backwards, picked when we want to be harvesting in the fall, and determined that we won't make any concessions on that side. So if we need to start backing our corn maturity days down in the spring based on a later planting date, we'll do that, versus just being like, well, we'll just plant later in the fall, or harvest later in the fall and deal with it then. No, we're going to make the changes early on, and so that doesn't throw our whole plan off just because we don't want to make that change.
Perfect, thanks.
So Nick,
yeah, Dan.
Nick, this is Dan. So yeah, as far as the timing goes, I mean, my drop dead date on Shred has been October 1st. But in reality, for consistent forage, you know, it probably should be September 20th, something like that. But and the reason for that, triticale is so dependent on tillering for yield. So triticale comes, you know, primarily the yield comes through tillers, and that is almost all established in the fall. And so if you don't get that, your yield potential is just greatly hampered. You know, cereal rye doesn't really do that. Cereal rye is a lot more just through height. And so I switched from cereal rye, or from triticale to cereal rye sometime in the end of September, 1st of October. And I realized that, you know, the upside and the quality aren't there. But you can still make cereal rye the lactating cow feed. You just got like this 20-minute harvest window. It's just a lot harder to do.
Hey, Dan, do you think that later planting, do you think that can be overcome a little bit by upping the seeding rate to just get more plants out there to overcome that sort of lack of tillering from later planting, sort of like people do with wheat?
You know, that was kind of what we always used to think, but I haven't seen the data to really back that up. It's just really difficult to do. And I think maybe Tom Kilser will have some more data on that, but yeah, it's really tough to overcome it. And yeah, I mean, I might start at 80 pounds, 90 pounds in August and move up into that 100 range, but going over that really late doesn't seem to make up for the lateness of the fall.
Okay, perfect.
Nick, if I can add one thing, I want to add to what John said was, you know, in terms of how we've backed into some of these grass mixtures with alfalfa problems the last 5 years. Really, there's been 2 or 3 years where we've had a lot of kill or things get drowned out, and we've backed into some of these grass mixes. So alternative forages aren't only, it is certainly about soil health and other things, but it's also about risk management. So by having an alternative forage, something that will grow, and I know that's what Dan has really done with his mixes, is it's, hey, if one thing doesn't work out, something else will. So if I've got grasses that are growing well, my alfalfa dies out, I'm still having a yield of something. So it is a risk management thing, and just kind of to build on what Dan said about his mixes, and I forgot to mention this before, when you're putting in a mix and you're harvesting it, and it's kind of a mix and you're not really sure what's there all when you're harvesting it, sample it, just sample it. And then so when you start feeding it, you can kind of plan ahead, how high quality is it, or is it in between, or is it, you know, so you can also plan feed rates. So there's some practical parts to this for sure.
Good comments. Good. I'm glad you interjected that, Paul. That's good stuff. One more question here from the group. In regards to nitrogen loss, how important is it to incorporate manure following a winter forage in a no-till situation? And I'm assuming when we say incorporate, we really mean kind of like low disturbance injection, because if it's incorporated, then it's not no-till. So I guess any of the farmers care to chime in on that and things you've noticed?
I can't really comment, you know, on that as far as any anything quantifiable. I guess, you know, I don't know if Paul has anything on that.
Not really.
That kind of sparked a question in my mind, and John, you had made a comment earlier about kind of, you know, not hitting the fertilizer target exactly right on some of your forages. And it's a question I have for for Paul that I think might be of interest to the group is, does the nutritional characteristics of some of these alternative forages, or even the corn silage that you make after maybe a trit crop, does it change at all, or how does it change if guys don't hit the fertility marks quite right and are maybe a little under on their end or something like that? How does that change the nutritional characteristics of those forages?
You know, the one thing that I find is interesting when we kind of look at forages across the last few years is, for example, this past year, some fields got really wet and then they had shallow roots, and then all of a sudden they started cannibalizing themselves. They were almost short on moisture later on in the summer, even though it wasn't that dry, because of soil conditions. So that's not only what you grew last year, it's your soil health, you know, what kind of soil you have. So I think, you know, whether once a plant starts cannibalizing itself, whether it's nitrogen deficiency, water deficiency, or something else, the fiber digestibility will go down and you'll have higher lignin as a percent in that corn silage. So you can see BMR corn silage, instead of being at 65 NDF, it might only be at 61, 62. And you kind of go look at that field and you go, yeah, it doesn't look like the healthiest plant because of, for whatever reason. Now, that might be nitrogen, water, other things, but it perhaps could be affected by what was the previous crop. Dan's probably got more to add to that.
Yeah, definitely. So there's two things. One is root development, like Paul said. I mean, just because you have adequate nutrients in the soil profile, if you don't have the root systems to go get it and to capture it, we can definitely see root, nutrient deficiencies. And that can be a lot of things. I mean, probably the biggest thing when it comes to alternative forages is just nitrogen and sulfur, and you'll see that in protein. That's probably the biggest, easiest thing to manipulate is protein percentage on these alternative forages based on the nitrogen and sulfur that's available for those plants. So, you know, you can very quickly take something from 14 to 20% protein through a fertility program. But when it comes to other things like fiber digestibility, those can be greatly impacted by root development and plant health. And that, I think, is where we can make some pretty big improvements. And we're starting to see even, you know, conventional corn silage in these really aggressive systems start looking more like getting fiber digestibilities that look more like BMRs even. And that's something that's exciting.
I think the thing is healthy plants, whether it's any reason for healthy plants, are going to get you higher fiber digestibility, whether that's healthy plants that aren't affected by fungi, herbicides, insects, anything that affects that plant from not being healthy. I'd rather have a very healthy plant that's not a BMR than a BMR that's got a lot of problems, you know. So it's healthy plants is high fiber digestibility.
Very good. So I guess the take-home message there is pay attention to your fertility and your nutrient management is important. We've got like 1 minute left. I'm going to try to squeeze in one quick question here because it's a little different change of pace than what we have been talking about, and probably more so for the farmers here. I'm going to direct this question. Have you guys noticed any difference in crop pests, weed pressure, more or less weed pressure when you start to diversify a rotation, more or less insect pressure, and any advice you could give to some of the folks listening today about mitigating some of those pests so maybe they can kind of avoid some issues that maybe you guys have had? Paul Natsky, you want to start? Anything to chime in there?
Yeah, I don't have anything worth commenting on that subject as of this moment. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thanks.
Yeah, the only what I can add to that is like we were discussing earlier with perennial grasses and stuff. So that gets us away from having a spray for weevil and leafhopper, stuff like that. So we haven't made any of those sprayer passes in quite a few years, which is pretty nice.
Cool. Thanks, John. Dan, anything on the pest front?
Yeah, well, there are a few things, like putting sorghum sedan or sorghum or anything like that into your rotation will break and pretty well any soil insect pressure. So prussic acid, which happens at frost, that goes out through the roots. So you can break a rootworm cycle or things like that 100% by including those kind of things in your rotation. But yeah, as far as even putting grasses with your alfalfa can definitely help eliminate a lot of the insect pressure in alfalfa. Probably the biggest thing that you want to be concerned about or watch is like armyworm pressure and some other things that could come in no-tilling corn into small grains. If you have a lot of that residue, watch for insect pressure in that crop. But overall, definitely a positive.
I'm glad you noted that last one, Dan. I was going to make a note of that if no one said it. Great. But with that, that is our time for the panel. Want to thank John Lamers, Paul Dyke, and Paul Natsky, and Dan Olson. Great discussion, guys. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to share your experiences, and hopefully the folks listening at home benefited from some of the things you had to share.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks again, guys. I'm going to kick it back to Jamie to get to our keynote.
Thank you, Nick. I'm just going to put a quick call out there. So Tom Kilser, have you joined us? We're having some technical difficulties with Tom. So I just want to ask if he's out there and we just don't see him.
Maybe we could just continue the panel discussion a little longer.
We will, or I have an alternative panel that I've put together in my head here for a second. If like I said, I just wanted to give a second to see if Tom had joined us yet, and otherwise we will we'll start a quick discussion here in a second. So, all right, Emily, if you would. So here's what happens when you attend a meeting and there's some technical difficulties. You have the opportunity to be pulled out of the lottery to be an impromptu panelist. So I've asked Emily if you would to call on Barry Bubels, Steve Huffman, Dan Brick, Matt Brugger, and Dan Dietrich. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show my screen, like I said, and show you some information that is new in the literature. So can you all, Nick, you'll have to help me here. Can you see cover crop is more important than crop rotational diversity?
Yes, I can, Jamie.
Perfect. Why don't you just go ahead and stay on with me? So
okay,
as we take a minute or two and wait for Tom to join us, what we're seeing out there, and there's some research also coming in from Wisconsin, when we think about soil health and the importance of soil health, what practices really matter when it comes to improving soil physical properties, biological and chemical properties. And some of the research, and we all know this is changing as this science develops, but what we're seeing, and this article in Nature that was just published, looks like this week or 2 weeks ago, is showing that crop cover is more important than rotational diversity for soil multifunctionality and cereal yields. So what this article is talking about, and you're going to see the same thing in the Wisconsin data, is that diversity is really important in promoting soil health, but probably more importantly is the amount of crop cover out there. So what we're talking about is having that living root. So this is the data that's out there supporting that living root all year long is very, very important. And what that does is it provides that food source for many of these microorganisms that to help these biological processes of building those chemical, biological, and physical properties. So I think the discussion you were having right now, Nick, talking about many of these overwintering cover crops, overwintering alternative forages is key, and what's going to be important to us in developing better soil health and improving water quality here in Northeast Wisconsin, because we know those overwintering cover crops not only have the potential to decrease risk through spreading out our manure applications over a longer period of time. They give us an alternative forage option. So when those times when we have winter kill and we need to have something else in our arsenal to feed our cattle, as well as that overwintering cover protects from soil erosion and Todd, you said the word dirt earlier on. I was going to correct you, but I didn't. So protecting that soil, making sure that that sediment doesn't reach our water bodies, but more importantly, looking at how these can improve soil health. So I'm not sure if any of my impromptu panelists want to join in and talk to me about, do we think this research is correct? Does this apply to here? So you'll see it was done in Europe. Is this verifying what we're seeing out there on the landscape? So any of our panelists from the last panel, or any of the new panelists that I called on here a second ago, want to make a comment? Or any attendee, type them in the questions. So I know many of you can't, with WebEx, you can't actually join in the conversation. We have a little more control over you in WebEx, but any comments? Does this?
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah.
It's Matt Bruger.
Excellent, Matt. So Matt, why don't you introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are, and then we'll take your comment.
So Matt Bruger, agronomist with Tilth Agronomy and project manager for the Upper Fox Wolf Demo Farm Network. And I've been working with the demo farms past 2 years, and we've been looking at similar things to what Jamie's presenting here, soil health and how that fits into basically creating an ecosystem in the soil, so having healthy soil. And I would say for the most part, we're still, like Jamie prefaced this, we're still deep in the weeds on this one. We've got to find our way out of them. And I use that term slightly jokingly because a lot of times when we talk about interseeding covers or having cover crops, they're looked at as weeds. And it's finding those benefits that diversity brings in having different release of nutrients, different aspects of the soil brought to life. You know, they talked about it in the last panel a little bit on just because nutrients are there doesn't necessarily make them available. So the hope is, as we move forward with soil health, is to not only increase the availability of nutrients, but also to be able to, in some sense, farm them by using the right species to set ourselves up for success in our row crops. So,
Dan, you popped. Thank you.
Jamie,
Thank you, Matt.
a couple comments.
Excellent, Barry.
Yeah, Jamie.
Oh, let's go with Dan, and then I'll go with Barry. So Dan, go ahead.
So probably the biggest difference from European research to where we are in the upper Midwest is our winters. And so we have a long period of time where hopefully the ground is frozen. And that's probably going to impact a little bit where, you know, just cover a growing crop over a European winter is probably going to have a bigger impact than maybe diversity. Whereas in the upper Midwest, I think, while it's very important, I think that may look a little different because of that. And I still like crop diversity, plant diversity, for a lot of different reasons, but kind of like what Matt said, probably the main reason is having varying degrees of nutrient release that diversity brings for us.
Barry, so if you want to introduce yourself and
Yeah, sure. Barry Bubos with NRCS. Get a chance to work with all the demonstration farm networks here in Northeast Wisconsin. So just, you know, listening to the comments from Matt and Dan, while I agree with them, I think when we're talking about implementing a soil health system, diversity very important. I guess what I see as a first step is trying to get that continuous cover through the year. So maybe living root continuous cover for as long as possible might be step one before diversity. So that's kind of where my mindset goes when working with producers.
And share my webcam.
so.
Okay, you have me on yet? Yep, you got me on.
Hi, Tom. So, all right, thank you, Barry. Like I said, and I was So there's a lot of great literature coming out. Like I said, as the science of soil health evolves, we're learning more and more each day. And so I think as we think about this, we hate to prioritize what is more important when it comes to soil health, but I wanted to use this article just to drive home the point that, and as Barry was discussing, cover is important. We're not saying that diversity isn't important, but cover is very, very important. So good morning, sir. So I would like
Sorry
to
about that.
no problem. So
I
let
was
me,
talking to somebody in Wisconsin, I mean in Minnesota.
those dang Minnesotans, I'm telling you. So I hopefully, can you go ahead and I'm not sure if I can, let me see if I can make you a presenter here, sir.
And you already switched it.
You already switched it. Perfect. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce our keynote this morning. So I'm pleased to introduce our last presenter of the day, Tom Kilser. So Tom grew up on a dairy farm in Columbia County, New York. He earned his AAS in agronomy from SUNY Cobleskill and a BS in fishery science from Cornell. He has worked on environmental impact studies for Peach Bottom and Indian Point nuclear plants. Excuse me. In 1976, he obtained a second BS in agronomy from Iowa State, and this is where I was going to put in my plug, Go Cyclones. For 33 years, he was a multi-county field crop and soils educator and a program leader for agriculture at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Rensselaer County, New York. In 2009, Tom made the move from extension to private consulting, conducting forage research and education in close cooperation with university and extension specialists and private companies. Much of Tom's effort is to develop alternative crops, rotation, and harvest systems to support high forage dairy diets that enable Northeast farms to compete nationally and globally. He continues his outreach to improve agriculture by sending a free electronic newsletter to over 1,000 CCA advisors, agribusinesses, and farmers in the Northeast, and has articles in numerous dairy and field crop agriculture magazines. Hundreds of seminars on his forage crops research have been presented across the US, Canada, Europe, and on YouTube. So with that, sir, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
And can you see me okay? Okay, I'm going to go ahead. You can hear me, you said?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll start then. What we're going to be covering here is winter forage economics and management impacts. This is something I've been working on for over 20 years. I think we started back in 1997, and the longer we worked on it, we kept finding more and more pieces. It has really taken off. In New York, we started out in 2010 around 2,000 acres. By 14, we were at 25,000 acres, and now we're at over 50,000 acres. And basically what is happening is the farm community is voting with their checkbook. They says, this works, this pays, this is making us money. When we look at cover crops can give you a really good benefit. Even within less than 2 years, you could see an improvement in your other crops by using cover crops. Well, cover crops cost money to put in, cost money to take back out again. But winter forages are cover crops on steroids. You get all the benefits. You are actually maximizing the soil and nutrient benefits, plus you get an immediate return on your checkbook. We ran an economic analysis back a couple of years ago. At that time, we were looking at a 1 ton dry matter per acre reduction in corn yield, which I'll talk about in a minute. Today, we say there is no reduction in corn yield because of the improved soil structure, soil health. The corn is actually yielding more following a winter forage. And so we're looking in this realm here of 0.7 of a ton to 1 ton of dry matter per acre as our break-even point. Now, on our variety trials last year, we averaged 3.6 tons of dry matter per acre, and that was right against the Canadian border. So it's as far north as you are. You can do it because we are already doing it. The big piece is improving your soil structure, the benefits to the next crop. Corn grain yields increase, soybean 3-year average increases. Nitrate in drainage water. You have a lot of lakes in your area. Water quality is a big issue. We're reducing the nitrate in drainage water 28 to 38%. What you're doing is you're taking money that was leaking out of your pocket and you're changing that over to being a protein supplement for your cows. And then we have a lot of clay soils that don't drain very well. We increase the surface permeability 7-fold by simply using winter forages and then following a crop into winter forage stubble. In yields, when we look at where we have a cover on the ground, the corn is going to be yielding more over a range of nitrogen conditions. But what I like about it is the surface that is left. This is what it looks like after you harvest winter forage. We have residue to keep the soil from washing away. We have material to catch raindrop impact to keep it from sealing the soil over. But we don't have a whole lot of garbage there to keep the soil cold, and we don't have a whole lot of stuff for the slugs to hide behind. So the slugs don't have cover to come out and then ruin the crop next to it. And I just found this morning is that there's actually a predatory beetle on slugs that likes winter forages. It lays its eggs and hides in them, and so then you have an additional predation. So we can grow really good corn crops right after winter forage. We use a clearing coulter to push aside the allelopathic effect. The residue here is going to leave compounds in the soil, and that will inhibit the next crop like corn, sorghum, teff, etc. It doesn't affect legumes. But if we use a clearing coulter to just push aside a thin layer, then we can come in and plant right into that, and we have no problem with allelopathy. I do want to caution you, I'm going to be talking more about the nitrogen in the soil system that we're using. But if you don't fertilize your winter forage enough, this winter forage will suck out every bit of nitrogen in the soil, and your corn will grow slow and yellow in the spring. To get around that, you can put some pop-up nitrogen in, and that corrects the issue. But what we found is if you fertilize the winter forage correctly, and I'll be talking about that more, you don't need to do that because there's any nitrogen not picked up is there as a residual for your corn crop to use. We've used it as a following crop to sorghum sedans. And in this case, they took off the sorghum sedans, no-tilled in their winter triticale. The sorghum sedan came up, the triticale came up, the sorghum sedan died on the first frost and gave a wind barrier to the drying cold winds to protect the winter forage. But the other thing it did is if you look at this upper right picture up here, that's what that field is. There was a stream in the back, it flooded on through, there was no soil erosion. We completely eliminated soil erosion, and in fact, the farmer reported gaining soil wherever the water had run. Now, growing winter forages is backwards from normal farming. Normal farming, we plant in the spring and we harvest in the fall. Winter forage, we plant it in the fall and we harvest it in the spring, a backwards system. In the rotation, it can increase dry matter harvested per acre 25 to 35%. You're harvesting 6 to 10 tons, and actually now that is up to 15. I just heard of a farmer in Ohio that was getting 15 tons of silage, 35% dry matter silage per acre. But you're harvesting that before the spring grasses or legumes are even ready. Look in the background. There are no leaves on the trees, but this farmer is mowing 3 tons of dry matter of very high quality forage. Putting that in the diet, we're talking about stuff for the high cows. We're not talking about heifer feed. We're not talking about dry cow feed. We have forage that farmers and nutritionists are growing specifically to put in the diet in the summertime, because when you get the summer slump, when the heat is on, the animal's intake goes down. but putting a higher digestible forage into the diet, like the winter triticale winter forages, the summer slump disappears and the cows keep milking right through the winter, or right through the summer. These are some fermented samples that we had. If you look at crude protein, our target is 20% crude protein. You will get that if you put enough nitrogen and sulfur on the field. Without sulfur, you won't get above 15%, and you'll see some of this data as I look later on. But we are targeting 20% crude protein, and the NDFD 30s is equal or better than some of the BMRs that are out there. So it's a highly digestible forage for your animals. When you put winter forage into your rotation, you can reduce winter and perennial weed pressure by simple competition. Nothing can grow underneath this rapidly growing aggressive crop. It controls particulated and dissolved phosphorus losses. You have all these waterways around you. You don't want algae blooms in them from the phosphorus. If that ground is sitting bare over the winter, peat particles are washing off, going into water courses, into the streams, and it's also leaching through the soil, going into the tile lines, into the streams. But having a winter forage there stops both of those losses, ties up the dissolved in the plant, and stops the erosion of the particulate phosphorus. So you are gaining both ways using a winter forage. Now, if you're going to start winter forages, the place I would suggest you start is the year before seedings. We use winter forages as a setup to doing seedings, and this has been immensely popular with the farmers in New York. Normally, when you do a seeding, the seeding year, you get half, 2/3 of a crop because it's planted and it still has to grow through the summer, etc. By growing a winter forage, taking the winter forage off, and then putting a seeding in, we are getting full yield on seeding year. So your seeding year, you don't have a slump. And the irony of it is the winter forage that we've added to that yield has more milk producing ability than most of the alfalfa. So you're coming out double ahead on that. You get better stands with no soil erosion. I had a farmer in central New York tell me he had a 60-acre field. They worked it up early in the spring. They put lime on it. They put tile lines in. They smoothed the whole thing up, worked it nice, picked all the stones, put their seeding in. Across the road, they had a 50-acre triticale field. They mowed the triticale off and then came back in early June and no-tilled their seeding right into it. By late June, they got 4 inches of partly cloudy in about 15 minutes. And he said our field that we put all our effort into was a mess. There were gullies all through it. There were stones washed out. The seeding had physically washed off the field. And he said across the road was 50 acres of the nicest alfalfa in the triticale stubble that had no damage whatsoever. So no tilling into a triticale stubble or a winter forage, winter rye stubble can make a big difference on soil erosion. This farmer took off his triticale, and in part of the field, it got rutted up a little bit. So he came in, he chisel plowed, he disked, he rolled, and he seeded, all those steps. The other half of the field, he just came in and he planted, no till, right into the triticale stubble. And you can see the difference. This is the same field, planted the same day. So this is the kind of difference that we're seeing. You're getting much better seedings, no tilling them into winter forages than to doing it into bare ground on the traditional system. What we would do is we would take our winter forage off. You go get the rest of your haylage done, and then we come back and we hit it with about 2/3 a quart of Roundup and 15 gallons of water carrier, because we want to get any of the little weeds that might be started. You give it an hour to dry, you come in with your no-till planter and you plant it. And what you are looking at is the results. There are no weeds or very few, if any, weeds in it, and it is growing a whole lot better. The other piece that we found with this is because of this stubble, we are getting better seedings. And what is happening in here is when you work up the ground conventionally, you plow it up, you smooth it all up, you disc it, you roll it, it's tabletop smooth. That wind will come right down to the ground and dry it out. If you have a 1-inch tall plant there with a 1-inch root system and you dry out the top inch of soil, that plant is toast. If you look at this upper left picture here, the wind can't get closer than 3 or 4 inches to the soil. And there's residue all over here to protect the surface of the soil. And those plants don't dry out. They are able to keep growing a whole lot faster. And because we are planting it later, they are not susceptible to a lot of the seedling diseases that come with the cool, damp conditions of April or early May seedings. So we reduce seeding risk. We increase seeding year yield. We're taking off 3 tons of dry matter before we start cutting our alfalfa even. As I showed you, we stop the erosion. We inhibit the weeds from the allelopathy. But more important, and what the farmers really like, is moving the workload from April to early June. Normally in the spring, we're out there, we're trying to spread manure early, and we're trying to till for seedings at the same time. And we got to put the seeding in and pick the stones. We have stones in our area. At the same time, we're trying to till for corn. Because we have to delay the corn tillage, we can't directly incorporate the manure, and we are losing 3/4 of the nitrogen from the manure we're spreading out there because we're not immediately incorporating it. Then we're planting our corn when we can get it in, and at the same time, we're trying to get haylage done. What we do is we take this part of the system and we put it here. In the spring, you're spreading manure and immediately working it in to capture that nitrogen. That sets the ground up ready to plant for corn. We come in and we can get our corn planted earlier. We have to start haylage earlier because we're taking the winter forage off. That's usually ready about a week or 10 days ahead of straight alfalfa. So we're in there early mowing that off. We get all our haylage done, and then we come in and we no-till our seeding in the beginning of June. Yes, that violates all the rules. You're not supposed to plant seedings that late. You're going to have all weeds. It's not going to work. BS, bad science. It works very, very well. We get exceptionally better seedings doing it in June than we do it with this early April seedings and the madhouse that you create on your farm trying to do that. It has worked very well. Now, establishing a high yield winter forage. We're going to look at variety selection, planting date, planting technique, fall fertilization, and harvesting for quality. First of all, what do we plant? Everybody gets excited about cereal rye. That's what we always use. Triticale will survive if planted right. We grow triticale right up to the Canadian border, and the Canadians are now importing tractor trailer loads of triticale. And you look at yield, this is a whole bunch of studies done in New York back in the mid-2000s. The triticale was higher yielding than the cereal rye and the wheat. The other thing that happens when you're looking at rye versus triticale, if we put over 50 pounds of nitrogen on rye, it tends to go down. We put 200 pounds on triticale, it didn't go down at all. Why are we pushing more nitrogen? The nitrogen was a nitrogen trial. That's why we went so high. But even so, you'll see by raising the nitrogen and sulfur, we can increase the protein to 20%. We can't do that with rye without it all falling down. And we have triticale varieties now that mature at the same time as rye. They are that early. So there are new varieties out there that are doing that. When I started doing this research, I kept getting yields that were, 2.25 ton, maybe 2.5 ton to the acre. I knew down in Pennsylvania, they were getting 5 ton to the acre. And I'm saying, why are they getting it? Well, I used to live down there, and they have a warmer, later fall. It gave more time for the plants to tiller. Where you're located is like we have in northern New York. You have a short season. It goes from summer into winter rather quickly. So we need to look at planting date, and this was critical. 10 days to 2 weeks before we plant our wheat for grain. We need to get our winter forages in the ground. Planted on time, you're looking at a really thick, high tillering crop. Planted late, you're looking at mostly bare soil. It had a huge impact on our yield, on our soil erosion, on our nutrient uptake, our weed control, and whether it was harvested early or late. By planting early, we get more tillers. This is our wheat planting date right here. By moving it up to an earlier planting date, we get more tillers. More tillers means more yield potential the next year. So we want to plant it earlier. For up in the Green Bay area, you're probably targeting the 1st of September to get it in the ground. By planting it on time, we got 30% higher yield. So it pays. Planting on time, it came off a week earlier in the spring. So it pays. Planting on time is very critical. Now, I know the realities of farming. Stuff happens. The corn didn't get matured. It may have gotten in late. You had bad weather or whatever. And now you're not going to be 10 days to 2 weeks ahead of the wheat planting day. Plant it anyway. You will get less yield, but you will still get good yield, and you will still get high quality forage. So you want to get it in on time. The big thing is not to put more seed out there. I know a lot of seed salesmen are going to hate me for this. They say, well, if you're planting a little later, bump the seeding rate up to 120 or 150 or 175 pounds an acre, it'll going to make up for it. Wrong, it doesn't work. I've done 2 studies separated by several years of where we planted different seeding rates on time and we planted them late. It made no difference. You got no more yield. All you did was hand more money to the guy selling the seed. You're better off using that to take your significant other out to dinner than you are giving it to the seed guy. You get nothing benefit out of it. There is no increase in yield. We use 100 pounds of the acre of seed. But what you can do is when you buy your seed, get a 3-way seed treatment on it, a fungicide, 3-way fungicide treatment. Where we used the seed treatment versus no, we had 15% higher yield than when we're planting on time than the control. If we were planting late, we still got less yield, but we got 28% more yield with a seed treatment than with none. So if you're planting late, still use 100 pound to the acre seed rate, but use a seed treatment, a 3-way seed treatment on it. Now, if we're going to be planting this earlier, that's going to crowd our corn. So we may have to shorten up our corn season. And that makes people hysterical sometimes. I don't want to give up my corn yield. My corn's giving me all this yield. I don't want to lose any. Well, Dr. Cox looked at the yield of corn varieties. And for every 5 days that you shortened up the season, you lost 3/4 of a ton of silage. So if we went from 105 day to an 85 day, we lost 3 tons of silage, or about a ton of dry matter, which is 3,780 pounds of milk. Using our average triticale yields with the shorter season corn, By adding the triticale, we are gaining 2.5 to 3.5 tons of dry matter, 10,000 to 14,000 pounds of milk in trade for losing 3,700 pounds of milk. You are further ahead with a shorter season corn and growing a winter forage than you are growing a longer season corn. That said, this yield reduction does not always occur. 2 reasons. First of all, as I showed you earlier, if you are improving your soil health and your soil structure, your yields go up. You saw that 3 to 5% yield increase. Secondly, what we have found with variety trials here, and Jeff Jackson out in your area agrees, is that shorter season corn, the breeding that has gone into shorter season corn has actually increased the yields, so now we're not seeing a yield reduction like they were seeing before. And I have shorter season corns on this, the 85 days, 80-day corns. There are some excellent ones in that 80 to 85 day that will really crank out the yield. And then you add the winter forage on top of it, you just increased your yield 25 to 35%. Now, planting on time, the benefits accrue according to the biomass that you produce. This is what we want to see going into the winter, not this right here. As we plant earlier, we're going to get more biomass. The amount of vegetation out there increases. The amount of tillers, as I showed you, increases. But more important on that, this is where our target planting date is. Excuse me. This is our target planting date. As we increase the amount of biomass, the amount, excuse me, the amount of nitrogen that we are storing in the soil, in the plant, goes up. We have stored 120 to 180 pounds of nitrogen going into the winter. This is a green manure storage system. Now, typically what we have on manured fields, you put the manure on in the spring, it's releasing all summer. You take the corn off the end of August, beginning of September, it is still releasing until the soil gets cold. Those nutrients releasing go into the watersheds, into the lake, and cause pollution, and you're losing money. But if we have a winter forage in here, and this is our typical tons of dry matter we are producing, planting on time, we are saving 60 to 100 pounds of nitrogen. That's money that was running out of your pocket into the watercourse. You are now saving in your pocket, and you're using that for feeding your cows. So you're coming out ahead double. Looking ahead as we're planting, one of the key factors you need to make a change on is your planter. These are the typical corrugated tubes that they have on the planters. Every time they bend, they hold the seed and then they dump it in piles. That is not how you get top yields. You see our corn planters don't do that anymore. Corn planters take each individual seed and put it in the ground. You need the same thing for sorghum and for winter forage. So by getting sleeve tubes, they slide straight up and down and they don't catch the seed and they allow for a more uniform stand. This is where you can get them. I don't know Phil, I have never met him. I've not even talked to him. I've talked to his wife when I was ordering parts. Very nice people, and I have no business arranging with them, but they sell these sleeve tubes. I highly recommend you change all of your planter tubes to being sleeve tubes if you have these corrugated type. This is what we were doing after we changed to sleeve tubes, and this is with a 1958 drill. A real old drill. We changed the tubes on it and it now has uniform stands out there. In your neighbor in Michigan, they went to singulated planting, which is the gold standard, planting each and every seed, and they use this a lot up in Canada. It reduced variability of the seed depth by 59%, Plant spacing was reduced 17%, the variability. Stand establishment improved 24%. Instead of buying more seed, do a better job planting the stuff that you have. The yield at one site went up 9%. The yield at the other site went up 15%. I had to deal with this for multiple years because the drill that I had where I was doing research, we did not have the funds to buy a new drill. And when a friend of mine brought in his singulated drill, it made a huge difference. This is our singulated drill versus our conventional drill. Even with the sleeve tubes in it, we had a 22% yield increase by having singulated seed versus drilled. So if you're planting winter forages and or you're growing any of the sorghums, I highly recommend you look at singulated drills. Now, triticale had a name of not being winter hardy. It turns out the problem was a hardware problem. The loose nut at the steering wheel didn't plant it deep enough. It needs to go in the ground 1.25 inches. If it doesn't, it'll freeze thaw over the winter, pop it out, and then the roots air dry and the crop doesn't grow. You need to get it in on time and in deep enough. And the later you plant, the more important it becomes for getting it in at proper depth. As we work with this crop over the 20 years, we realize there are two nitrogen managements. There is the fall nitrogen and there is the spring nitrogen, and you need to get both pieces correct. This is the spring nitrogen trial where we had no nitrogen in the fall. Our yields went up as we put more nitrogen on in the spring. If we put 30 pounds of nitrogen on in the fall, our yields went up across all nitrogen rates. We gained. If we put 60 pounds of nitrogen on, our yields went up even more, but they didn't go up after that. The 90 and 120 pounds of nitrogen didn't give us any more spring yields than putting on the 60 pounds in the fall. Now you're saying, well, these are some high nitrogen amounts that you're putting out there. Yeah, you got to feed the crop. At this rate, 3¼ tons of dry matter, you're looking at 20% crude protein is removing 205 pounds of nitrogen and about 25 pounds of sulfur. You need it in the soil to grow the crop, but you need it in the fall to grow the crop. Coming back to what I said before, if you are manuring your cornfield and really pouring it on, there's a lot of organic nitrogen still releasing after the corn crop comes off, and it can supply that 60 pounds of nitrogen. If you don't have manure on the field or just a light coating, then putting the 60 on in the fall will make a significant difference in yield the following spring. There is a certain hysteria, though, that if I plant early and I put a lot of nitrogen on, it's going to smother out over the winter. That is BS, bad science. This was planted early with 120 pounds of nitrogen. This was planted late with 120 pounds of nitrogen. This was planted late with no nitrogen. They all died. And the reason they died had nothing to do with how early or how much nitrogen. It depended on where the water laid on the field when you got that March thaw. March, early April, you'll get a thaw, the ground is frozen, and we have ponds in places we never had ponds before. Wherever that water lay, in this case it lay and then froze, but wherever that water lay, you're going to get snow mold, and snow mold will kill out the stand underneath. It's not the early planting, it's not the nitrogen, it's snow mold. Now we are looking into some work that came out of Canada. They came in November, early December before the first snow, and they sprayed elemental sulfur and a spreader sticker on the field. And they said that kept the snow mold from happening. Now, that's not registered in New York, but you can go out and spread elemental sulfur and a spreader sticker, and you just tell the pesticide guys that we're putting fertilizer on, and you are perfectly legal. That is perfectly legal to do. We're still trying to prove that this is what is working. We tried it last year, but we had no snow mold. So it's a very seasonal type of thing we're researching. But either way, as I mentioned before, the sulfur. I put urea on, 115 pounds of nitrogen, I got 12% crude protein. I only put 100 pounds of nitrogen on as ammonium sulfate. I got 17% crude protein. You need to add sulfur. A typical dry mix that we use is 3/4 of a ton of urea with an anti-volatilization. Agritane is what we used to use. I think they have a new one called Agribol or something like that. And then 1/4 ton of ammonium sulfate mixed in with it. Gives us a 38006. We come in the spring and put that on, and that meets our needs to supply the sulfur for the high protein. Now, when we were doing this research, I was working with Dr. Ketterings at Cornell. I have a bunch of tests that are in this chart. And one of the things that they found was, lo and behold, there was a whole bunch of fields that got up to 3 tons of dry matter per acre at 0 spring nitrogen. I said, hey, that's what I want to do. I don't want to spend money on fertilizer if I can help it and still get full yield. Every one of these fields had manure on them. They dumped a bunch of manure on, worked it in, and then planted the crop. So we were looking at that. And I had a farmer friend of mine, Curtis Martin. He says, I'll do that. So he went and plowed down a bunch of hog manure. I mean, immediately he spread it and immediately right behind incorporated, not 4 hours later, not the next day. He was capturing all the ammonia. He came in, he planted his crop. We came back in and put a nitrogen trial on top of it. We were getting up to 3 tons of dry matter, but there was no significant yield difference from 0 to 120 pounds to the acre. I thought, this is working pretty good. That could be a way we can get rid of manure and not have to buy fertilizer and get 20% crude protein. I was wrong. When we looked at the protein, the 0 spring nitrogen on the plowed down manure was 9% crude protein. Where we put 120 pounds of nitrogen on, it was 19% crude protein. We needed the nitrogen in the spring to meet the needs of the crop. If you look at the economics of doing that, well, that 120 pounds of nitrogen is about $84 worth of fertilizer. The protein we produced at 19% was $308 of protein for $84 of nitrogen fertilizer if we were getting 3 ton dry matter per acre yield. If we were only getting 2 ton dry matter per acre yield, we were getting $200 of soybean meal savings for $84 worth of fertilizer. So it worked from that standpoint. But I still didn't want to buy fertilizer, and I have a lot of manure to get rid of, and I'd rather use it to meet the needs of the crop. We can't spread it after corn harvest before we plant because labor is busy getting the corn harvested. Manure application is going to delay winter forage and do more damage to yield than what you save putting the manure on. The manure application may compact the soil before planting, and so it may not grow as well. And we still need more nitrogen in the springtime anyway. So I just saw, I had heard an earlier conference in Penn State, and they were saying the same thing. If you get a choice between planting your winter forage and putting on manure, plant your winter forage. That is the most important thing to get in as soon as you can. We do not suggest top dressing manure on in the fall or spring. This picture down here is typical of what our winter forage looks like going into the winter. That's 8 to 12 inches tall. You spread manure on that, it's going to get incorporated into the vegetation. We have one farm that we were pretty sure that's what they did. they had some horrible results. You mix manure in with a high sugar, highly digestible forage, and you put it in the silo. They had a slimy, maggot-filled mess that, in spite of the nutritionist saying, don't feed this to the cows, they fed it to the cows and killed a couple of cows. You do not want to do this at all. Better off, if you're at this stage, to go ahead and put fertilizer, nitrogen, and sulfur on than to use manure. That being said, we looked into another option. This happens to be a bazooka injector, and no, I don't own any stock in the business. It runs at a shallow angle, lifts up the sod, tears it up without slicing it. A finger unit will smear the sides and bring up stones. A smooth culture will smear the sides and not let the manure soak in. The wavy culture lifts it up, pours the manure in, and then it soaks in sideways into the crop underneath. We put 14,000 gallons down at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a clay soil, and the next morning the only thing in the slot was a thin film of organic matter. So we came in to early planted or on-time planted triticale that was 12, 14 inches tall. Opened it up, lifted up, put the manure in, and then pushed it back closed again. We were putting 8,000 gallons of manure per acre on. There was no smell. We did this the Monday before Thanksgiving. The last Monday in November is when we did this. And when we did it, the soil is cold, so all the nitrogen stays in the ammonia form until spring. And then as the soil warms, the surface warms up, and then the deeper layers warm. And so the triticale starts growing before the ammonia starts releasing from the manure. But as it releases, then the triticale or the winter forage is there to grab onto it right away. It's an environmentally sound method that allows you to unload manure in November and December and still have it there in the springtime. We have a closing coulter that pushes that slot closed. I don't know if I had it set right. We think if we came back with a roller the next day, it would have left a smooth field, pushed everything flat. We've also found we can use the same system on intensively managed grasses. This is Paul Sarasoletti up in the Catskills, and they came in this winter and injected the manure right into the grass fields. They said they were saving $60 an acre on the cost of nitrogen. Yes, they did pop up a ledge rock here or there. They were running it at a 6-degree angle. If they ran it at a 4-degree, he said, I don't think we even would have popped up that one stone. So it's a system that has huge potential. On every farm, I've done the calculation. You usually can pay for these units in 1 year on nitrogen savings. So it's something to seriously consider for feeding your winter forage. Where we did this study, I planted on time with no manure. As we increased the nitrogen in the spring, the crude protein increased. Remember, we were shooting for 20% crude protein. If we plowed manure down and planted on time, we increased the crude protein for the lower nitrogen rates, but to get to 20% crude protein, we still needed fertilizer, 120 pounds. If we planted it on time and then came in November and injected 8,000 gallons of manure, we started out at 17, almost 18% crude protein. And we got to 60 pounds of nitrogen, we were at 20% crude protein, half the nitrogen rate. But we used 8,000 gallons of manure. If we had put 12,000 gallons of manure out there, we would not need any nitrogen to completely feed this crop, and we would have had 20% crude protein, and the organic release would then feed the next corn crop that is going in behind the winter forage. So it's a system you need to seriously look at for environmental reasons, for reducing cost on the farm, by recycling and using more of the nitrogen in your manure. And then finally, for putting the manure out without it getting into the waterways and streams. So let's look ahead a little bit more to the last piece I want to cover. Grab a drink here. We're harvesting winter forage, and this is either triticale or rye. The stage of growth is a bigger effect than the species. It doesn't matter which one you're growing, it matters when you harvest it. Quality goes down as yield goes up, and what we are targeting is stage 9 or flag leaf stage. When you're looking at your plant out in the field, this is stage 8. There's another leaf rolled up here, still coming out. This is stage 9. The last leaf is out. There isn't another leaf coming out, and right here is the stem, the head, ready to burst forth. Stage 8 happened on a Thursday. Stage 9 happened on a Tuesday, and in that time, we had a 35% yield increase. So you want to hit it at the right stage. We don't let it go through to early heading or boot stage, as they say, because you're starting to lose quality. That being said, two things. First, if it at stage 8 and they're expecting 4 or 5 days of warm, rainy weather, harvest it at stage 8 if you're feeding this to milk cows, because you need the quality. You don't need a whole bunch of fiber out there. Secondly, if you're at stage 9 and you can't get it harvested, but the temperatures are cold, and up in Green Bay, it's not the tropics, I know, just like northern New York isn't the tropics, and so the temperatures stay low. You can often harvest it at stage 10 and have the same digestibility at stage 9 if it goes down into the 30s or below 40 degrees at night, and it doesn't get real warm during the day. It'll hold quality over a longer growth period. So that's adjustment that you can make for the Green Bay conditions. Harvesting this, you need to use the wide swath same-day haylage system. That's critical. It's a high sugar crop. 20% at harvest is common. It's high yielding. There's a lot of stuff out there, and you need to get it dry. Photosynthetic drying is what wide swath haylage does. You're taking carbon dioxide in water. In the presence of sunshine, the water is in the plant. In the presence of sunshine, it produces carbohydrates, sugar, and it dries the plant. That increases the energy or the sugar that's in the forage, which makes it easier to ferment and gives you more milk producing ability. If you mow it and you leave it overnight, or you mow it into a narrow windrow, which means less than 80% of the cutter bar width, it ends up, it is respiring in that windrow or at night. It's burning off the sugars and turning it into carbohydrate and water. What you are doing is you are compost drying your forage. But if it's cold at night, you can leave it overnight, you're okay if you're down below 40 degrees. But if it's warm, you need to get it off. This farmer was mowing, and like any farmer, he didn't want to drive on the haylage, so he put the deflectors in on the front, and he had 2 piles here. The piles will not dry. The sun is not shining there. They are packed together, and they're basically composting. And the sunlight is not hitting the surface of it. He is at, when I totaled this up, he was at 66% of cutter bar width. Adding insult to injury, he had these deflector shields on, and as it hit, it made a lump and then dropped. And the better the quality of the feed, the bigger the lumps that you make, and lumps do not dry. So we opened up the front shields and we flipped up the back and let it flow out the back. First of all, opening the front shield, we are now at 80% of cutter bar width. Yes, he drove on this, but it's on a thick mat of stubble, so it's not getting pushed into the dirt, and it's still photosynthesizing. And this underneath that was buried is now out in the sun and can dry. And it's feeding out of the machine in a very loose falling swath that doesn't compact, doesn't pack up. That picture that I just showed you, this was a deflector down. It was maybe 6 inches tall. This was the deflector up, so it was flying out. It was 16 inches tall. The sunlight could penetrate it. The air could penetrate it. This will photosynthetically dry faster than all the lumps that you made here. But we still aren't finished yet. There's still a problem. And the problem is we get high yields. This is first cut alfalfa. This is a low yield of winter triticale. This is the average yield of winter triticale, and this is the high yield of winter triticale. And actually, this should be 15 because we have farmers that are now getting that much. It comes out the back of your mower and it lands with a splat. And what it'll do is normally it's drying on the top and it's composting the thin layer underneath. But with a thick layer, it's drying on the top, but it can't dry underneath because there's such a mat of material there because your yields are so high. So the simple answer there we found is you mow it wide. 2 hours after mowing, you're mowing it at greater than 80% of cutter bar width. 2 hours after, we come in with a tedder and we lift and loosen it. That's going to speed the drying of it. I had a neighbor that had a 75-acre field right behind my house. I could look out my window and see it. And he had a 14-ton triticale crop out there. And he mowed it, he laid it wide, and he complained to me and he said, it's not drying. I said, you need to get that tedded. So I looked out my window and here goes this little tractor with a twin tedder behind it, another little tractor with a twin tedder behind it, and a third little tractor with a twin tedder behind it. He hit up all the square bale guys in the area to borrow their tedders, sent them down to that 75-acre field. They tedded it, and that was at 10 o'clock, and at 2 o'clock he was chopping 35% dry matter material. You need to do that with these heavy crops. The key though is when you're tedding, watch your forward speed so you're not making tedder lumps. You need to tear it apart. If you go too fast, it'll pile up and throw it out as a lump out the back and not dry. But this picture here previously, let me back up. This is a 3-ton dry matter per acre crop. He mowed it at 10 o'clock and at 2:30 he was chopping 35% dry matter material. It can be done, it is being done using the right techniques. So in the harvested triticale, you want to mow wide. The swath needs to be greater than 80% of cutter bar. There's no need to condition. Conditioning does not help. It is actually counterproductive. You want to ted after 2 hours, and then you want to merge it back together and chop it at least around 1 inch long because it's a BMR-like crop. We want a longer enough piece that you get the extent of digestion in the rumen before it gets flushed out. We need that effective fiber, but it breaks down so fast. If you chop it fine, it's going to flush out too quick. So we want to chop it longer, and we want to ensile it the same day as you're mowing it. Use a good homolactic bacteria. It will ferment it very quickly. The real high sugar that we have in it, especially with the wide swath system, allows full fermentation even at higher moisture levels. So if you are interested, I continue to do research on this crop and I put the information out in a newsletter. You can subscribe here at TFK1, TFK1@cornell.edu, or you can go to my website, www.advancedagsys.com, and there's my email. It's a free newsletter that I have out.
All right, thank you, Tom. So I know some of us need to be moving on to our next point of the day. So I'm going to wrap up, but Tom has graciously volunteered to stick around after the webinar to answer your questions. So just a few housekeeping items. So if you don't already, soon you should see a link for a survey in your chat box. If you would, please take a moment to provide us some feedback on today's event. If you don't have time at this moment, you'll be receiving the same link in a follow-up email after today. So also just a reminder that we do have 3 breakout sessions coming up the next 3 Tuesdays from 9 to 10 a.m. They will be on, and I see Emily's posting them now, manure management with John Vandenboom, grazing with Adam Abel and Dan Dietrich, and irrigation with John Vandenboom again. So you still have time to register if you haven't, and the URL is posted there. And the next slide will show us our QR code. So if you need CCA credits for today, if you are able to, you can scan that code. Otherwise, please put your first name and last name in the question box along with your CCA number, and we'll make sure and get you the credits for today. Last but not least, I want to thank you all for coming to today's Lower Fox Farmer Roundtable. I'm confident, as I know I am, I was able to take away some new insights, some information, and some enthusiasm from listening to today's speakers. I also want to take this last opportunity to thank our Roundtable sponsors, as well as all of our presenters today, because without them, today would not have been the success that it was. And for those of you who want to stick around, we will be back with that question and answer. And in the meantime, again, thank you again. And I look forward to seeing most of you again next Tuesday from 9 to 10 a.m. when we talk to John Vandenboom. So thank you all, and we will go to questions with Tom. So I do have a few questions coming in. The first one is your research primarily focused in tilled systems, and do you believe the same principles would apply in no-till systems?
Personally, I prefer a no-till system. I think that takes maximum advantage of that stubble that is left there. If you chisel plow a triticale field, you'll want to consider no-till real fast because you've got a whole bunch of large softball-sized root lumps all over the place. So I would go ahead and no-till right into it. As I showed you that one picture here, I don't know if you can see this picture or not, but having that type of a system, no-till works very well.
Excellent. We did have a question about pest management. So some years we do have some problems with armyworms. Have you seen any issues with insects in some of your winter trit and rye rotations?
All right, when the moths move into this crop because of our harvesting time, you're basically, the armyworm is just increasing the protein. They're getting chopped up in no time at all, because this would typically come off for your area. You're probably looking at the 20th to the 25th of May up around Green Bay, depending on the year, of course. In our areas, we're between the 5th of May and the 20th of May, depending on the season. We were going earlier and earlier. Now we're moving back to later and later. Very typical between the 15th and 20th of May. If any armyworm gets in there, they're still real small. They're going into the chopper and into the silo.
Excellent. Again, I remind you, if you have questions, please post them in the question component on your control panel. We had some discussion earlier, Tom, about bags as well as drive-over piles versus upright silos. Do you have an opinion on how we store this forage and what's ideal?
If you use good siling practices, any one of those can work. If you're putting it in an upright, you need to get it at 35% dry matter because that's a lot of hydraulic pressure if it's wetter. We can ferment it a whole lot wetter, but you're hauling water. And if you're putting it in an upright silo, that could cause problems. Probably the biggest thing, regardless of where you're putting it, is to simply use a good quality inoculant so that you get good fermentation. In bags, probably the biggest concern I have with the bags is the quality, the condition of the bagger. As the teeth get worn, they get rounded. And so it's like a fork mashing potatoes rather than pushing it in. And so rather than pushing the feed into the bag, you're just mushing it, and that's going to increase the amount of liquid running back out again. In an upright silo, as long as you're doing that longer length of cut, you are better off. It's going to reduce potential leachate. Funny story on that is I had a farmer who forgot to change his chopper from when he was doing haylage, and he chopped all his triticale at 1/4 of an inch. They put it into the silo. They packed it real nice. They put the plastic over the top and tucked it in. And he said, as the week went by, this bulge on one end of the silo got bigger and bigger. And one day he heard a whoosh and the entire plastic was yanked off the whole silo, laid out flat, and a wall of liquid went running down across his field. He had chopped it too small, and the smaller you chop it, the more liquid you're going to have running out. That's why we like to see around 3/4 of an inch to an inch length of cut, because this is a highly digestible, fragile fiber that we want to stay in the rumen, and we want to reduce the leachate.
Excellent. The questions are coming in now. What about no-till drill seeding early in spring before growth of forage takes off if the soil is fit?
Okay, I have done frost seeding with red clover into triticale. This is before we knew how to grow triticale. The triticale was planted in October, so it wasn't a real thick stand. In the spring, it was a heavy soil. He came in, the ground was frozen, and he broadcasted red clover on it, and he had an excellent stand. Now that we know how to grow winter forage, we planted earlier and we put nitrogen on. Nothing is going to grow underneath it. I tried clover underneath it, and there wasn't a single piece of clover except for where the drill missed. There wasn't a single piece of clover in the field, and clover is shade tolerant, which is one of the beauties of the crop. If you're managing it right, you're wiping out your winter annuals. They cannot compete with this crop. And so that's why we went to the point of, gee, can we plant it after triticale is harvested? And that has worked phenomenally well. The first year I tried it, we had a drought. We took the triticale off. I came in, I planted the alfalfa. We had 3/4 of an inch of rain. I planted the alfalfa, and we had no rain until about the middle or end of July. A friend of mine looked at it in September, and he said, it looks like a 2-year-old stand. I don't know what it's growing on, but it's still growing. And that's the common reaction of the farmers. We don't know what it grows on, but it just keeps on growing. It really works as a system for putting in seedings right into the winter triticale, winter forage system. It is phenomenal well system to do.
Excellent. Can you talk about the green bridge of insects when no-tilling corn after winter forage?
All right, the more vegetation you have out there, the more bugs are going to be attracted to it because they like to eat it. But what we find is that if you look at the field after it's cut off, there isn't much left for them to eat. The birds move in really fast. They're looking for bugs also. And so we have enough residue to intercept raindrop impact. We have a massive root system to keep the soil porous and from washing away, but we don't have cover for the insects. We don't have anything for them to eat. And so you are reducing the insect pressure tremendously by not having a green mat there. I know the whole idea of planting green is one of the ways they're doing it, or killing a cover and leaving the mat there. There's trade-offs with that, and we eliminate those trade-offs, A, by making money growing some of the best digestible forage we can, and then secondly, removing that off of the field, so then we can get a really good crop coming on afterwards using a no-till system with a clearing coulter.
Thank you, Tom. I'm not sure, but are you passionate about this system? So this is fun.
I do get wound up eventually, yes.
Well, that's good. Like I said, in these virtual events, we can't be monotone. So
well,
like
I grew up on a farm. My dad was a farmer. My brother's a farmer. I know how hard it is farming. And if I can come up with ways of making it easier, more effective, environmentally sounder, and profitable, that's what I live for.
Excellent. No, their questions are pouring in. So you are doing research on direct cut forage sorghum as well. Where can I find more current info on forage sorghum management?
Go to my website and just click on newsletters and go on down through. There's a bunch of newsletters in there. In 2018, August and September, was that when I did it? No, it was June and July of 2018, I think, has a whole write-up on variety trials, different kinds of sorghums. What did we do? What didn't work? We make mistakes. My job is to make the mistakes so you don't have to. So my farmer friend says, well, yeah, we know you're a professional screw up. So, but that's what I do is I make the mistakes so you don't have to. But go to my newsletters and you can go down through the newsletters. And if you sign up for my newsletter, the January issue just had a breakthrough on male sterile sorghum, that research we are doing, and the February issue is going to have the feed rations that came out of that work. It is something that is really going to change the whole picture out in the field, especially with the use of sorghums. We are changing feed quality phenomenally using a whole different technique of growing sorghum.
Well, I'm going to put in
my newsletter.
Well, and I'm going to put in a shameless plug. We're going to be talking a little bit about sorghum at the Focus on Forage webinar you're doing for us on February 10th, are we not?
Yep, and I will be including, you will see the data there.
Excellent. So for those of you who haven't seen that, the Focus on Forage webinar series from Extension, Tom will be presenting on February 10th, and that is from 12:30 to 1:30. So look that up. So we'll hear more about sorghum there. Next up question. So what do you do to mitigate allelopathic effects of rye and trit when seeding alfalfa after a winter forage harvest?
That's the beauty of it. Legumes aren't affected. Allelopathy doesn't affect legumes. I says, oh, well, if that's the case, why don't we put it to work for us? It keeps weeds out. It keeps other garbage from growing. So why don't we put this to work? And so I took my drill and I went out and we went and planted some. We said, well, we don't know if this is work or not. Let's give it a try. So we did. It worked phenomenally well. Allelopathy works for you when you're growing legumes. Now, if you're seeding an alfalfa grass mix like we like to use, meadow fescues and the like, there's a snowball's chance you're going to get the meadow fescue to establish. So what we do is we plant the alfalfa. When we take the first cutting off, we come back with the drill, run through the field, and we put in a little bit of meadow fescue, and we're in business. Excellent. But the allelopathy is working for you.
So there are some questions. So up in Northeast Wisconsin, we're going to be looking at some variety trials on spring triticale. So do you have any experience with spring triticale and what we should be looking for if that becomes part of our rotation?
I did a little bit of work with spring triticale. Put it bluntly, we had horrible results. I can't say the word that I want to say, but it was horrible results. It did not grow very well. It looked awful. It did awful. And I said, why are we growing this? And the guy said, well, because they wanted me to test it. So we tested it. But triticale, spring triticale, if I'm growing a spring crop, I'd rather put oats in. Now, that being said, they up in Canada, right across the border from you guys in Ontario, they're no-tilling spring wheat into frozen ground and got an 8% yield increase in grain yield by doing that. And so maybe that's the thing you need to look at is if you're going to plant spring triticale is use a no-till drill. A no-till drill will cut in a ½ inch into frozen ground and you just tuck the seed right in there and let it take off after that. Something way out there for you guys to try.
Yeah, that'll be interesting because like I said, this is why we do research, right? So they're going to let me fail with spring triticale, so they don't have
company. I like company in the sinking boat.
So have you tried any companion crops with the fall planted trit to increase the diversity or protein content, such as vetch, peas, clover?
That's interesting because I was just listening to Kirsten from Penn State. And they did exactly that. I tried peas. Yes, the peas came up the next spring. When I looked at the amount of biomass that was there and the cost of the peas that was in there, I said, this is stupid. This isn't economical. There isn't, yes, it is there. And what happens is because the plants are so small and still growing, they supply no nitrogen for the other crops, and it's just for themselves, and they contribute negligibly to the yield that's coming off. And so right across the board, Penn State and myself are in agreement. Don't monkey around with it. It's not economical. It's a nice way to sell seeds, but it's not going to be economical for you. You're better off putting the proper nitrogen and sulfur on to raise the protein and increase the yield, and you will get more yield than you will adding in a whole bunch of very expensive legume seeds that are there, you can show everybody, but they contribute nothing to the crop.
Excellent. All right.
Was I wishy-washy enough on that?
No, you're pretty direct. That's what I like. Well, and that's where I think that sometimes, when we talk to universities, we're always like, well, it depends. So it's kind of it's refreshing, I will say, even as a university person, to hear something very direct. So we have that. I'm looking like I don't have any more questions, ladies and gentlemen, out there in the cyber world. Do you have any more questions that you want to post into the question box for us? We'll give you a minute or two. As they're thinking about that. Oh, here comes one. As they're continuing to think, what about a 15-inch planter for establishing trit early in the spring with somewhat frozen ground?
If you're using a 15-inch planter, you're going to have to turn around and come back again to get enough vegetation. It's something we dealt with sorghums. We planted sorghums in 30-inch row, 15-inch row, and in 6 or 7-inch row, and we prefer 6 or 7. You could do one trip across the field, but if that's the only machine you have, then you go across the field, come back at an angle, or come back, split the rows. It's not hard to do. I've done it, and you get a more uniform stand out there with less weeds. I want to maximize the sunlight that's intercepted as soon as possible. That's the whole gig we're working toward.
Excellent. All right, you got another minute or two to type in a question.
And I do apologize for being late there this morning. That was a screw up on my part. It's been hectic.
It is what it is. Like I said, it gives me the opportunity to improvise and wing it. So that's why I was laughing. That's why I get paid the big bucks, is to wing it. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, any last questions for Tom today? I am waiting.
And the newsletter is on my website. So if you go to my website, you can decide if you want to sign up. If you don't, that's fine. You can still read them. I post them each month out there, and there's all back issues with a lot of this information and research is on there.
Okay. I am not seeing anything in my Q&A queue. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will unless something comes in the next 2 to 3 seconds, we're going to wrap up today. Thank you, Tom, for joining us. We really appreciate the insights. And like I said, as we move to new systems here in Northeast Wisconsin, this was invaluable information.
Okay, and if you ever want to do it again, I'm available.
Wonderful. And like I said, for those of you, Tom will be joining us on February 10th again. And last but not least, again, so Emily has posted the thank you for attending slide. Again, these are our sponsors and our team members who helped to put this webinar together. So please thank them for their time, energy, money, and efforts. So we love to be able to bring new and exciting education out to the landscape. So with that, thank you again, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you, Tom.